Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, maybe just the quiet corner of the room where the day finally stops asking things from you. Because tonight we're going somewhere most people think they already understand. We're going back to World War II, but not only to the beaches, not only to the battlefields, not only to the generals standing over maps with pins and cigarettes and sleepless eyes. We're going back to the moment when the United States, a country still carrying the bruises of the Great Depression, became something much larger than it had ever been before. Not overnight exactly. History almost never changes that cleanly. But there was a morning when millions of Americans woke up and felt, in a way they could not ignore anymore, that their country had crossed a line. The old life had not simply been interrupted. It had been taken apart and replaced by a new one, full of factory whistles, ration books, troop trains, bond drives, shipyards, uniforms, telegrams, and maps of oceans most people had never expected to care about. And here is the strange thing about power. It does not always arrive looking like power. Sometimes it looks like a woman tying a scarf around her hair before walking into an aircraft plant. Sometimes it looks like a farmer watching his son leave on a bus with other young men from town. Sometimes it looks like a half-built ship sliding into grey water while welders are already waiting to start the next one. Sometimes it looks like coffee poured before dawn in a kitchen, where the radio has been left on too loud because no one wants to miss the news. The United States did not become the most powerful country on earth only because its armies fought across Europe and the Pacific, though they did. It became that powerful because the war reached into nearly every home, every factory, every bank, every port, every classroom, every farm and every office, and turned a civilian country into a machine that could produce, finance, transport, feed, arm, and organise a global war on a scale almost no one in the world had ever seen. Before we go there, before we step into the noise and the smoke and the fear of that transformation, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Is it late where you are? Are you hearing this with the lights low, or while the rest of the house is quiet, or maybe while you're doing something ordinary with your hands? I always like thinking about that. History sounds different depending on where it finds you. A story about war feels one way in a busy room, and another way when the night has settled, and the world outside your window has gone still. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself drawn to the ordinary people inside enormous events, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you stop for a second and feel that little pull that history sometimes gives us. When the past suddenly feels less like a list of dates and more like a room full of people who are just as tired, worried, hopeful, and human as we are. Now let us go back to a morning in December 1941. Not to the battlefield first, not even to Pearl Harbor itself, but to the American home after the news had already arrived. Picture a kitchen somewhere in Ohio, or Iowa, or California, or Pennsylvania. The floor is cold, the coffee is thin, a newspaper sits on the table, and the headline is too large to feel like ordinary news. The radio has been speaking in urgent voices since the day before. Adults are trying to sound steady. Children know something has happened because the grown-ups are not moving through the morning in the usual way. On December 7th, Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, sinking or damaging battleships, killing thousands, and pulling the United States fully into a war that had already been consuming much of the world for more than 2 years. On December the 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt stood before Congress and called the previous day a date which would live in infamy. Almost everyone knows that phrase. It has become one of those sentences history keeps polished on a shelf. But what matters for us tonight is what that sentence did inside ordinary American life. It turned distance into responsibility. It took a war that many Americans had followed in newspapers and newsreels and made it personal. Until then, Europe had been burning, China had been suffering, the Atlantic had been dangerous, Britain had been bombed, and American ships had already faced deadly risks. But for many families, the war still belonged somewhere else. That illusion could not survive Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, the map was no longer a thing printed in a schoolbook. The Pacific Ocean was not empty space. The Atlantic was not a protective moat. The world had reached the front door, and the United States had to decide what kind of country it was going to become under pressure. But the truth, and this is important, is that America had already begun changing before that December morning. The country did not wake up from complete sleep. It had been stirring, arguing, preparing, resisting, and producing. Franklin Roosevelt had spoken of the United States as the arsenal of democracy in December 1940, a full year before Pearl Harbor, urging Americans to help arm nations fighting Nazi Germany. Lend-Lease, signed into law in March 1941, had allowed the United States to send weapons, food, ships, trucks and supplies to Britain, the Soviet Union, China and other allies. American factories were already taking defense contracts. Shipyards were already expanding. Airplane plants were already hiring. Still, there is a difference between preparation and surrendering your whole national life to war. Pearl Harbor removed the last wall between those two things. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what America was before the war changed it. In the late 1930s, the United States was powerful on paper, but unsure in spirit. It had enormous natural resources, a large population, a vast industrial base, oil fields, railroads, farms, universities, banks, and factories. Yet it was also a country wounded by the Great Depression. The crash of 1929 had not simply taken money from investors. It had emptied homes, closed banks, broke farms, and made millions of people question whether the system around them still worked. By 1940, recovery had come to many places, but not fully, not evenly, and not in a way that erased the memory of breadlines and foreclosure notices. There were men still remembering the shame of looking for work and finding none. There were families still stretching meals. There were towns still carrying the dust of the previous decade. This is why the transformation matters so much. America did not enter the war as a relaxed giant casually deciding to show its strength. It entered as a country that had doubted itself for years, and then, almost unbelievably, the same factories that had once stood idle began to run day and night. The same unemployed men who'd waited outside hiring offices were pulled into shipyards, steel mills, aircraft plants, and training camps. Women who had been told for years that their place was at home now found themselves building bombers, packing shells, inspecting engines, driving buses, and working in offices that kept the war system moving. Farmers were asked to produce more food than ever, not only for American families and soldiers, but for allies overseas. Scientists were pulled into secret projects. Universities became research centres. Hollywood made films for morale. Advertisers sold war bonds. Children collected scrap metal and rubber. The war did not sit on the edge of American life. It moved into the centre of the house. Think about how quickly the scale of daily life changed. A young man in 1940 might have expected to work in his father's store or on a farm or in a local factory, or to keep searching for a job if the Depression had not yet loosened its grip on his town. By 1943, that same young man might be in uniform, crossing the Atlantic in a troop ship, sleeping in a barracks in North Africa, training in England, fighting through jungle mud in the Pacific, or standing on the deck of a ship built by workers who had never seen an ocean until the war gave them one to serve. His sister might be earning wages in a factory for the first time in her life. His mother might be saving bacon grease, reading ration stamps, rolling bandages, and watching the mailbox with a fear that arrived every afternoon. His father might be working longer hours than he had ever worked, not because there was no work, but because there was suddenly too much of it, and because the government wanted more planes, more tanks, more engines, more shells, more ships, more everything. This is the part of the story that is easy to lose when we focus only on the fighting. Wars are not won only by the men who fire rifles. They are also won by the countries that can replace rifles when they break, feed armies when they move, fuel planes when they rise, repair ships when they limp back into harbour, lend money without collapsing, organise transport across oceans, and keep production going after the first excitement has worn off and everyone is exhausted. World War II made the United States powerful because it forced the country to prove it could do all of those things at once. Let us sit for a moment inside the word arsenal, because it can sound clean and official if you say it too quickly. An arsenal is not just a warehouse full of weapons, it is a system. It is mines and railroads and engineers and clerks and machinists and accountants and dock workers and truck drivers and cooks and nurses and scientists and inspectors. It is coal and steel and rubber and oil moving through channels that have to be coordinated with almost impossible precision. It is a plant manager being told that what was once an automobile factory will now build aircraft engines or tanks. It is a worker learning a new skill under pressure, because the old skill is no longer enough. It is the government signing contracts so large that they would have sounded unreal only a few years earlier. It is a country discovering that its strength was not only in what it already had, but in how fast it could reorganize itself when survival demanded it. By 1944, American factories were producing aircraft in numbers that would have seemed almost absurd before the war. Shipyards were launching Liberty ships with a speed that astonished both allies and enemies. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, artillery, radios, uniforms, boots, medical supplies, canned food, and ammunition moved out of plants and depots in a constant stream. The United States supplied its own armed forces and also became the great supplier of its allies. British soldiers drove American trucks. Soviet forces received American food, vehicles, locomotives, aircraft, and raw materials. Allied armies moved with help from American industry, even when the fighting took place thousands of miles from American soil. This was not charity. It was strategy. It was also the beginning of a new world in which American production, American finance, and American logistics became central to the survival of other nations. And yet for the people living through it, the rise of American power did not feel like a neat historical process. It felt like long shifts, crowded trains, separation, noise, worry, and rules. It felt like rationing sugar and gasoline. It felt like saving tin cans. It felt like blackouts along the coast and air raid drills in schools. It felt like telegrams arriving at doors and mothers learning to fear the sound of a car slowing down outside. It felt like a town losing its young men one by one, then seeing strangers arrive to work in new plants. It felt like women standing at machines with aching feet and being told they were temporary workers even while the country depended on them. It felt like African American workers moving to defense jobs and still facing discrimination in hiring, housing, unions, and military service. It felt like Japanese American families being forced from their homes and incarcerated by the same government fighting in the name of freedom. The making of American power was real, but it was not clean. It lifted some people, used others, excluded others, and asked sacrifices from nearly everyone. This is why the story cannot be told honestly as a simple tale of triumph. The United States became the most powerful country on earth through a war against fascism and empire, but it did so while still carrying deep injustices at home. Black Americans fought for what the Pittsburgh Courier called a double V: victory abroad against enemies and victory at home against racism. Women entered industrial work in huge numbers, then were pressured to leave many of those jobs when the war ended. Japanese Americans lost homes, businesses, farms, and years of freedom because fear and racism overpowered constitutional promises. Mexican American workers, Native American code talkers, immigrant families, poor white farmers, union workers, and many others all became part of the war effort in different ways, not always equally honoured and not always equally protected. If we're going to understand how America rose, we have to look at the whole machine, including the hands it praised and the hands it ignored. But still, the scale of what happened remains difficult to comprehend. The war took the United States out of the long shadow of the Depression and placed it at the centre of the world economy. It expanded the federal government's role in American life. It joined universities, corporations, laboratories, and military planners in ways that would continue long after the fighting stopped. It created new military bases, new technologies, new habits of global command. It made the dollar more important. It made American factories indispensable. It taught American leaders that oceans no longer guaranteed safety. It taught other nations that American power was not only military, but industrial, financial, scientific, agricultural, and cultural. Imagine being an ordinary American in 1945 and trying to understand what had just happened. In 1941, your country had been attacked and frightened. In 1942, it was scrambling, mobilizing, learning. In 1943, it was producing at a pace that changed the war's direction. In 1944, American soldiers were landing in Normandy, advancing across the Pacific and supplying allies across the world. In 1945, Germany had fallen, Japan had surrendered, much of Europe lay shattered, cities from Warsaw to Berlin to Manila had been devastated, Britain was exhausted, the Soviet Union had suffered losses on a scale almost impossible to measure, and the United States stood with its homeland physically untouched by the kind of destruction that had ruined so many others. American factories were intact. American farms were intact. American banks were strong. American industry had expanded. American ships crossed every ocean. American troops occupied defeated countries. American officials helped design the United Nations. American money would soon help rebuild Europe. American atomic bombs had introduced a terrifying new age. By the end of the war, the United States was not simply one strong country among many. It had become the country without which the New World Order could not be arranged. That sentence sounds grand when we say it now, but inside it were millions of private moments. A worker leaving a night shift as the sun came up over a factory roof. A soldier folding a letter from home and tucking it into a pocket. A mother standing in line with the ration coupons. A child pressing tin foil into a scrap drive ball. A banker reading government bond totals. A scientist walking past armed guards into a secret facility. A welder watching sparks fall like brief orange rain from the side of a ship. A president aging visibly under the strain of decisions no human being could carry lightly. This was how power was made, not only in speeches and declarations, but in repetition, in production, in obedience, in fear, in ambition, in grief, and in the daily work of people who could not see the full shape of what they were building. I want you to think about that for a moment. Most people who live through turning points do not know they are inside one. They know the price of meat has changed. They know their neighbour's son has enlisted. They know the factory is hiring. They know the lights are on late at the plant now. They know the newspaper feels heavier. They know the radio has become part of dinner. They know the map pinned to the wall has more meaning than it used to. But they do not know how historians will describe them. They do not wake up and say, "Today my country is becoming a superpower." They wake up tired. They put on shoes. They go to work. They listen for news. They do what the day requires. And maybe that is the most important way to enter this story. Not from the top, with flags and conferences and speeches, but from the ground, where the transformation could be felt in the weight of a lunch pail, the sound of a whistle, the absence of a sun, the arrival of a paycheck, the stamp on a ration book, the heat of a factory floor, and the uneasy feeling that the future had sped up and no one had asked permission. World War II did not simply make America stronger. It changed what strength meant. Before the war, power could still be imagined as territory, armies, navies, and wealth. After the war, power also meant production lines, oil reserves, scientific research, global bases, financial systems, food supply, alliances, communication networks, and the ability to shape what happened far from home. America learned to operate at that scale during the war, and once it did, it could not easily return to being the country it had been before. So tonight, as we follow this transformation, keep one image in your mind, not a battlefield, not yet. Picture instead a factory door opening before sunrise. Workers are arriving in the dark. Some are sleepy, some are nervous, some are proud. Some are there because the pay is better than anything they knew during the Depression. Some are there because a brother or husband or son is already overseas, and this is the only way they can feel useful. The machines inside are waiting. The lights are harsh. The air smells of oil, metal, and heat. Somewhere far away, a battle will eventually depend on what is made in that room. A pilot will need that engine. A soldier will need that truck. A sailor will need that ship. An ally will need that food. A government will need that loan. The world will need what America is becoming, and America is only beginning to understand the cost of becoming it. The country that entered the 1940s was large, rich in resources, and protected by geography. But it was still uncertain, still divided, still shaped by the hardships of the previous decade, still hesitant about how much of the world's trouble it was willing to carry. To see how dramatic the change really was, we have to step back before the attack, before the full mobilization, before the factories reached their wartime rhythm, and look at the giant before it fully stood up. Because before America became the arsenal, the banker, the supplier, the liberator, the occupier, and the architect of a new global order, it was something else entirely. A powerful nation not yet sure it wanted to use its power. A giant with one eye open, listening to the world grow louder beyond the walls. Before the United States became the arsenal, the banker, the supplier, the liberator, the occupier, and the country that would sit at the centre of the post-war world, it was still trying to decide what kind of country it wanted to be. That is the part we often rush past. We look backward from 1945, from aircraft carriers, atomic bombs, the United Nations, the dollar, the Marshall Plan, American bases overseas, and the enormous confidence of a nation that seemed to have stepped into command of the modern age. Then we assume the rise was obvious from the beginning. It was not. In the years before World War II, the United States was huge, wealthy, well-supplied and protected by oceans. But it was also cautious, bruised, and deeply unsure. It had the strength of a giant, but it did not yet have the habits of one. It had factories that could change the world, but many of them had recently been quiet. It had millions of workers, but many had spent years wondering whether work would ever return. It had a navy and an army, but not yet the kind of military machine that could fight across the entire globe. It had money, land, oil, coal, steel, wheat, machines, engineers, and ports on 2 oceans, but it also had a powerful desire to stay out of other people's wars. To understand how dramatic the change would be, you have to begin in that hesitation. Picture America in the late 1930s, not as the confident superpower we know from later decades, but as a country still arguing with itself at the kitchen table. The Depression had not vanished from memory. It was not some distant financial event. It lived in the bodies of people who had stood in bread lines, lost farms, watched banks close, sold furniture, patched coats, and learned to stretch meals in ways that became habits. Even in homes where work had returned, the fear of losing it again remained close. Parents who had once promised their children that hard work was enough had spent the previous decade discovering that hard work did not always protect a family from collapse. Men who had built their identities around wages and usefulness had carried the humiliation of unemployment. Women had held households together with a discipline that rarely made it into speeches. Children had grown up understanding that a closed factory was not an idea. It was an empty lunch pail. It was a father at home in the middle of the day. It was silence where pride used to be. This was the country watching Europe fall apart. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Americans were still deep inside their own crisis. When Germany rearmed, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, when Japan expanded its war in China, when Spain became a battlefield for fascists, communists, republicans, monarchists, and foreign volunteers. Many Americans followed the news, but they did not all see it as their responsibility. The United States had entered the First World War in 1917 after years of hesitation, and the memory of that war still weighed heavily. More than 100,000 Americans had died during that conflict, many from disease, many in a short, brutal period of combat. Families remembered the casualty lists. Veterans remembered mud, gas, shellfire, hospitals, and promises about making the world safe for democracy that had not seemed to deliver the peaceful world they were told would follow. In the 1930s, a common belief spread across the country that America had been dragged into that earlier war by bankers, arms makers, and European politics. Whether that belief was fair in every detail mattered less than the fact that millions accepted it. It shaped how people listened when leaders warned about danger overseas. So when the clouds gathered again, a large part of the country said, "Not again. Not our sons. Not our money. Not our ships crossing dangerous oceans to rescue empires that might simply return to their old habits when the fighting stopped." In Congress, this mood became law. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s were meant to keep the United States from sliding into war the way many believed it had before. They restricted arms sales, loans, and travel on ships belonging to nations at war. The idea was simple enough. If trade and finance had pulled America toward war before, then cut the ropes early. Stay clear. Let the old world handle the old world's violence. This sounds sensible when you imagine it from a quiet American town in 1936 or 1937. A shopkeeper in Indiana, a farmer in Nebraska, a factory worker in Michigan, a mother in Oregon, a schoolteacher in Kansas. They were not looking at the world through the eyes of a future superpower. They were looking at their own bills, their own sons, their own memories of the last war, their own hopes that the Atlantic and Pacific might still do what geography had always seemed to promise. Oceans had protected the United States for generations. Why should that change now? Why should a family still recovering from one catastrophe volunteer for another? And yet, the world was changing in a way that made old protections less reliable. Airplanes flew farther. Submarines threatened shipping. Radio carried foreign crises into American homes faster than newspapers had once done. Trade connected economies whether citizens liked it or not. Japan's expansion in Asia threatened American interests in the Pacific. Germany's domination of Europe threatened Britain, and if Britain fell, the Atlantic would no longer feel like a comfortable barrier. Still, knowing this in policy circles was not the same as convincing an entire democracy. Democracies do not move like machines. They argue, they resist, they require persuasion, and persuasion takes time. Franklin Roosevelt understood this better than most. He was not an isolationist, but he was also a politician who knew the country he governed. He could not simply order Americans to become global leaders before they were ready to accept the burden. He had to move them gradually, sometimes more carefully than he wanted, sometimes using language that reassured as much as it warned. Roosevelt saw Nazi Germany as a grave threat, but he also understood that many voters feared another European war more than they feared the possibility of German victory. So he spoke about defence, aid, preparedness, and the protection of democracy without moving too far ahead of public opinion. He asked Americans to imagine their security differently, not as a wall around the country, but as something connected to the survival of friendly nations beyond the sea. That argument did not win everyone, not even close. The America First Committee, founded in 1940, became one of the most visible voices against entering the war. It drew students, business leaders, Midwestern conservatives, progressives suspicious of war profiteers, and ordinary citizens who believed intervention would ruin the country. Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, became its best-known speaker, and his speeches attracted large crowds. To some Americans, he sounded like a man trying to protect the country from another disaster. To others, especially as his language grew darker and more controversial. He sounded dangerously blind to the moral and strategic threat of fascism. The argument split households, newspapers, churches, campuses, and political circles. This is worth remembering because the later unity of wartime America can make the earlier division disappear. Before Pearl Harbor, there was no simple national agreement. There was anxiety, there was anger, there was genuine uncertainty. While Americans debated, Europe moved quickly. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. Britain and France declared war. Then came the shocking speed of German victory in Western Europe. Denmark and Norway fell. The Netherlands and Belgium were overrun. France, which many people had expected to hold for a long time, collapsed in 1940. British troops escaped from Dunkirk, but they left behind huge amounts of equipment. Suddenly Britain stood almost alone in Western Europe, facing the possibility of invasion and nightly bombing. For Americans who'd imagined Europe's war as a distant repetition of old rivalries, the fall of France was a hard jolt. A major power had been defeated in weeks. The German army did not look like a temporary disturbance. It looked like a force that could reorder the world. Inside the United States, the meaning of preparedness began to change. It was one thing to say America should not fight in Europe. It was another thing to say America should remain militarily weak while dictatorships were conquering countries at speed. In 1940, the United States passed the Selective Training and Service Act, the first peacetime draft in American history. That fact alone tells you how serious the situation had become. A country deeply reluctant to enter war still accepted that it needed to train men before a war arrived at its own door. Young men registered. Families took notice. The military expanded. Training camps filled. Uniforms became more common. The old distance between civilian life and war began to narrow, but even then, the American military was not yet the overwhelming force it would become. In 1939, the regular army was small compared with the armies of the major powers. It had professionalism, tradition, and capable officers, but it did not have the size, equipment, or global reach required for the conflict ahead. The Navy was stronger, and American naval planners understood the importance of the Pacific and Atlantic. But even the Navy would need enormous expansion. The Army Air Corps had promising aircraft and ambitious leaders, but the air war that would come required production on a scale that still had to be built. The United States had potential, enormous potential, but potential does not stop tanks, escort convoys, land armies on hostile beaches, or carry bombers over enemy cities. Potential has to be organised. It has to be funded. It has to be trained. It has to be turned into schedules, contracts, factories, barracks, depots, fuel lines, and shipping. This is where the sleeping giant image becomes useful, but only if we take it seriously and not as a cliché. A sleeping giant is not weak. It is dangerous because of what it could do when awake. But while it sleeps, others may misread it. They may see slowness and mistake it for permanent softness. They may see argument and mistake it for paralysis. They may see a democracy debating and assume it cannot act. Before the war, America gave its enemies reasons to wonder if it had the will to fight. The country was rich, yes, but reluctant. Industrial, yes, but not fully mobilized. Protected, yes, but spread across two oceans with commitments it had not yet fully accepted. Its people did not want war. Its army was not yet ready. Its factories were still partly civilian. Its politics were loud and divided. From the outside, if you wanted to believe America would hesitate too long, you could find evidence. At the same time, if you looked more carefully, you could see the giant beginning to shift. Defense spending rose, aircraft orders increased, shipbuilding expanded. The government began working more closely with business leaders. Old factories received new contracts. New plants were planned. The language of emergency entered ordinary economic life. A company that had once thought in terms of cars, refrigerators, typewriters, sewing machines, or farm equipment began hearing from Washington about engines, guns, tanks, aircraft parts, and military vehicles. Engineers who had spent their careers improving consumer products were asked to think about mass-producing war materials. The American genius for standardization, assembly lines, and large-scale production had not been invented for war, but war would soon give it a terrible and urgent purpose. Think about an automobile plant before the change. The machinery, the workforce, the discipline of production, the supply chains, the managers, the engineers, the rail connections, all of it existed already. But it was arranged around civilian demand. Families wanted cars, businesses needed trucks. Dealers expected shipments. Then war planning arrived and asked a different question. Could this plant make aircraft engines? Could that plant make tanks? Could a factory that once produced typewriters produce rifles or gun parts? Could a refrigerator company help build bomb casings or military equipment? Could shipyards simplify designs so vessels could be built faster by workers with less specialized experience? The answer was often yes, but the yes required redesign, confusion, training, mistakes, shortages, negotiations, strikes, and pressure. Mobilization was not magic. It was a struggle carried out in offices and factory floors before it became visible as military strength. For the workers, the change could feel both promising and unsettling. After years of unemployment and underemployment, defense jobs meant wages. They meant movement. They meant crowded boarding houses in boom towns, packed buses, new lunch counters, long shifts, and a sense that the country was finally hiring again. A man who had felt useless during the Depression could now walk into a plant where his labour mattered. A woman who had been told paid industrial work was not for her might find that the emergency made old rules flexible, at least for the moment. African American workers moved toward defence centres, hoping that war jobs would open doors that had been closed too long. Migrants from the south and rural areas headed towards cities and shipyards. The war before the war, the preparation before the official entry, was already rearranging the population. But it also exposed old tensions. Defence industries often discriminated against black workers. Some unions resisted integration. Housing near booming plants became scarce and overcrowded. Local communities struggled with sudden growth. The federal government wanted production, and production required labour, but the country's racial and social divisions did not disappear because a factory received a contract. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, a major black labour leader, threatened a march on Washington to protest discrimination in defence industries. Roosevelt, wanting to avoid embarrassment and disruption, issued Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defence jobs and creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This was not the end of discrimination, but it mattered. It showed that the war emergency could force changes the country had resisted in ordinary times. American power was being built inside conflicts over who would be allowed to work, who would be allowed to serve, and who would be recognised as fully part of the nation. There is another part of pre-war America that we need to sit with for a moment. The strange coexistence of abundance and fear. The United States had oil in quantities that most countries could only envy. It had steel mills, coal mines, machine tools, electrical capacity, farmland, railroads, and ports. It had the physical ingredients of power. Yet millions of Americans had recently lived through scarcity. That combination shaped the national mood. A country can have vast resources and still feel insecure if its people remember empty pockets. Roosevelt's New Deal had already expanded the role of the federal government during the Depression, building roads, bridges, dams, schools, parks, and relief programs. It had accustomed many Americans to a government that intervened more directly in economic life. That mattered when war came. The administrative muscles built during the Depression did not automatically create victory, but they made large-scale wartime coordination more imaginable. Still, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the future was not clear. A family listening to the radio during the Battle of Britain did not know that the United States would become the dominant post-war power. A senator debating aid to Britain did not know exactly how long Britain could hold. A worker taking a defence job did not know whether the country would enter the war or simply keep supplying others. A young man registering for the draft did not know whether he would train and return home or end up crossing an ocean. People lived forward, as we all do, without the comfort of knowing the ending. That uncertainty is what gives this period its tension. We now know Pearl Harbor is coming. They did not, at least not in the way we know it. They knew relations with Japan were worsening. They knew the Pacific was dangerous. They knew embargoes, negotiations, and military planning were underway. They knew war was possible. But daily life still had a stubborn way of continuing. Stores opened, children went to school, couples married, baseball games were played, movies were released, people argued over politics, rent, wages, prices, and whether Roosevelt had too much power or not enough. The future approached while ordinary routines continued, which is how disaster often arrives in real life, not with everyone standing still and staring at the horizon, but with people busy, distracted, and only partly prepared. If you had walked through an American town in early 1941, you might have seen signs of change, but not yet total transformation. A recruiting poster in a post office, more talk about defence work, a newspaper headline about Britain, a scrap of conversation about sons registering, a factory hiring notice, a neighbour leaving for a job in a city, a radio speech from the president, a church prayer for peace, a debate at the diner over whether America should help Britain more directly. The old life was still there, but war had begun pressing its outline into it. And then there was the matter of money. Wars are fought with soldiers, but they are also fought with credit, taxes, bonds, and purchasing power. The United States, unlike many countries already battered by war, still had the financial capacity to lend, buy, build, and expand. Britain, by 1940 and 1941, was under enormous strain. It needed weapons and supplies, but it could not pay indefinitely in cash. Roosevelt knew that if Britain fell, the United States would face a much more dangerous world. Lend-Lease answered that problem by allowing the president to send aid to countries whose defence he considered vital to American security. The phrase itself sounded almost neighbourly, as if America were lending a garden tool over a fence. In reality, it was one of the great strategic decisions of the era. It made the United States a supplier of war before it became a combatant in the full sense. It also tied American security to the survival of other nations in a way that pointed toward the post-war world. For American industry, Lend-Lease meant orders. For allies, it meant survival. For isolationists, it looked like a dangerous step towards war. They were not entirely wrong that it moved the country closer. Roosevelt knew that. His opponents knew it too. But the world had reached a point where not choosing had become a choice of its own. Sending aid carried risks. Refusing aid carried different risks. The United States was learning a hard lesson. A country with enormous power cannot always preserve safety by pretending events beyond its borders do not concern it. I want you to imagine the emotional confusion of that moment. Many Americans hated Hitler and still did not want war. Many wanted Britain to survive but did not want their sons sent overseas. Many believed Japan was dangerous but hoped diplomacy could contain the crisis. Many supported preparedness but feared militarism. Many distrusted big government but accepted emergency measures. Many wanted peace and sensed peace was slipping away. This is not hypocrisy. It is human. People often hold conflicting desires when the stakes are terrible. They wanted safety without sacrifice, strength without war, aid without entanglement, preparedness without loss. History would not allow all of those things at once. By the time 1941 moved toward its final weeks, the giant was no longer fully asleep. It was turning, opening its eyes, reaching for tools, still not standing entirely upright, but no longer still. American ships were involved in dangerous Atlantic operations. American aid was flowing abroad. American men were being trained. American factories were receiving military contracts. American planners were thinking in global terms. Yet the final emotional break had not come. The country was not yet unified by attack. The debates had not ended. The full machinery had not yet reached its wartime speed. That is what Pearl Harbor changed. It did not create America's resources. It did not invent American industry. It did not suddenly teach the country how to build machines. It did something different. It removed hesitation as a national position. It took all the arguments about whether the war would come and answered them with explosions, smoke, sinking ships, and dead Americans. The country that had spent years trying to stay out now found itself inside. The half-awake giant stood up, not gracefully, not perfectly, not without confusion or injustice, but with a speed and force that would astonish the world. And once it stood, everything that had been potential began turning into action. The factories that had been preparing would now be pushed beyond anything peacetime business had required. Shipyards would become cities of steel and sparks. Automobile plants would stop making cars for ordinary families and begin making the machinery of war. Women would enter industrial work in numbers that changed how Americans imagine labour. Black workers would demand access to the jobs their country needed filled. Farmers would produce for armies and allies. Scientists would be brought into military secrecy. The federal government would become the great organizer of American production. The question would no longer be whether the United States could avoid the war. The question would be how fast it could build the tools to win it, and how much of itself it would have to change in the process. The question would no longer be whether the United States could avoid the war. The question was how fast it could build the tools to win it, and how much of itself it would have to change in the process. That is where the story moves now, away from the speeches and the maps for a moment, and into the places where power stopped being an idea and became something you could smell, hear, count, and load onto a freight train. Into the factory districts where windows glowed late into the night. Into shipyards where sparks fell from steel plates in bright showers. Into automobile plants where machines that had once shaped doors and fenders were taken apart, rearranged, and ordered to serve a different purpose. Into rooms where men who had spent their lives thinking about sales and production quotas now sat with military officers and government officials talking about bombers, tanks, trucks, shell casings, engines, propellers, and deadlines that did not care how tired anyone was. This is one of the things that made World War II different for the United States. The war was not only fought overseas, it was assembled at home first. Before an American army could cross the Atlantic in strength, before American bombers could fill the skies over Europe, before American troops could land on islands scattered across the Pacific, the country had to make the material world that would carry them there. A modern war consumed machines the way a furnace consumes coal. Tanks broke down. Ships were sunk, aircraft were lost, trucks wore out, guns overheated, tyres shredded, engines failed, uniforms tore, boots rotted in mud, ammunition disappeared by the ton in a few hours of fighting. The country that could replace those losses again and again and again would have a kind of strength that was not glamorous, but was absolutely decisive. So picture an American factory floor in 1942. It is not quiet. It is never quiet. The air is full of metal noise, compressed air, shouting, whistles, rolling carts, cranes, and the steady thud of production moving through stations. The workers are not all the same people who would have stood there 5 years earlier. Some are older men who had known depression layoffs and are now working overtime. Some are young men waiting to be drafted or already rejected from military service for medical reasons and determined to do their part in work clothes instead of uniform. Some are women who have never before been hired for industrial work and who are learning to rivet, weld, inspect, wire, drill, and operate machines with a seriousness that leaves little room for anyone's old assumptions about what women could do. Some are black workers who have moved north or west looking for defence jobs and are finding both opportunity and resistance. Some are migrants from farms, small towns, mining regions and southern counties where work had been uncertain for years. Everyone has arrived inside a system that needs speed, discipline and endurance. The government did not simply hope this would happen. It forced, funded, directed, negotiated and organised it. In January 1942, Roosevelt created the War Production Board, which became one of the central agencies responsible for converting American industry to wartime production. Its work was not romantic. It was paperwork, allocations, priorities, contracts, permissions, disputes, and constant pressure. But paperwork can change history when it decides who gets steel, who gets copper, who gets rubber, who gets machine tools, who gets workers, and which civilian products have to stop so military production can begin. The War Production Board told companies what they could make and what they could not make. It limited the production of civilian automobiles. It redirected raw materials. It pushed factories towards standardized designs and mass output. It helped turn the private machinery of American capitalism into something that could serve a national military emergency. That change was enormous. In February 1942, the production of civilian cars for ordinary Americans came to a halt. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you how total the shift became. The automobile was not just another product in the United States. It was one of the great symbols of American life. Freedom, wages, factories, highways, suburbs beginning to stretch outward, teenagers dreaming of movement, families driving to visit relatives, salesmen on the road, farmers bringing goods to town, and then, almost suddenly, new cars were no longer something ordinary people could buy. The plants that had built them were needed for war. Detroit, the great motor city, became one of the beating hearts of the arsenal. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Packard, Studebaker, and dozens of other companies received military contracts. They did not all do the same work. Some built tanks, some built aircraft engines, some built trucks, some built parts that would disappear inside larger weapon systems and never receive public glory. The American auto industry had spent decades mastering the assembly line, learning how to break a complicated object into repeatable steps, how to train workers for specific tasks, how to move parts through a plant with speed, how to reduce waste, how to standardize production. That knowledge became military power. The same habits that had once made cars affordable now helped make bombers, jeeps, armoured vehicles, engines and weapons on a scale that enemy planners had not fully understood. One of the most famous examples was the Willow Run plant in Michigan, built by Ford to produce B-24 Liberator bombers. The plant itself was staggering, nearly impossible to imagine as one building if you have never stood near something of that scale. It stretched across acres of land with an assembly line designed to move heavy bombers through production in a continuous flow. At first, Willow Run struggled. That is important to remember. The great wartime production miracle did not begin perfectly. There were delays, shortages, design changes, management problems, worker turnover, and the difficulty of adapting automobile methods to an aircraft made of hundreds of thousands of parts. A bomber was not a car with wings. It required different tolerances, different inspections, different skills, and a different relationship between speed and safety. But the pressure did not stop, and the plant improved. By 1944, Willow Run was producing B-24s at a rate that became one of the symbols of American industrial force. Think about what that meant. Somewhere in Michigan, workers shaped aluminum, installed wiring, fitted engines, checked instruments, tightened bolts, and inspected seams. Weeks or months later, that machine might be flying over Europe, carrying bombs, crews, fear, and strategy inside its metal skin. A decision made at a workbench could matter over enemy territory. A missed floor could kill men far away. A well-made part could bring them home. The distance between factory and battlefield was huge, but the connection was direct. That connection gave American industry a moral weight that ordinary production had not carried in the same way. A car sold to a family was a product. A bomber sent to war was a responsibility. The same was true in the shipyards, though the rhythm there was different. If factories gave the United States air power and mechanical force, shipyards gave it reach. Without ships, American power would have remained trapped behind oceans. Soldiers needed to cross the Atlantic and Pacific. Tanks, trucks, food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and spare parts had to move with them. Allies needed deliveries. Convoys needed replacement vessels because German submarines were sending ships to the bottom of the Atlantic. The ocean was not simply a blue space on a map. It was a battlefield, a highway, a graveyard, and a test of industrial endurance. The Liberty ship became one of the clearest answers to that test. It was not beautiful in the way old passenger liners were beautiful. It was not built for elegance. It was built to be simple, standardized, sturdy enough, and fast to produce. These cargo ships could carry thousands of tons of supplies across dangerous waters. They were welded rather than fully riveted, which saved time. Their design allowed parts to be prefabricated and assembled quickly. Shipyards under industrialists like Henry J. Kaiser pushed production to astonishing speeds. At the Kaiser yards in places such as Richmond, California and Portland, Oregon, workers built ships at a pace that would have sounded impossible before the emergency. Some record-breaking vessels were launched in only days, though the average took longer and required fitting out after launch. Still, the larger point was clear. America could replace ships faster than the enemy could sink them. That sentence contains one of the most brutal forms of wartime arithmetic. The German U-boat campaign depended on cutting Britain's lifeline and disrupting Allied supply. A submarine commander did not have to defeat an army in the field. He could attack the cargo that kept armies alive. Food, fuel, trucks, ammunition, aircraft parts, and raw materials were all vulnerable at sea. If the Allies lost ships faster than they could build them, no strategy on land would matter enough. The United States answered with shipbuilding so large and relentless that the ocean began to tilt back toward the Allies. Each Liberty ship sliding into the water was not just another vessel. It was a statement that industrial output could become a weapon against blockade. The shipyards changed American communities almost overnight. Richmond, California, for example, grew at a speed that strained housing, schools, roads, hospitals, and social life. Workers arrived from all over the country. People who had never seen the West Coast came looking for wartime wages. Southern migrants, black and white, moved into cities that were not prepared for them, and often did not welcome them equally. Women entered shipyard work in large numbers, welding and riveting in places where men had once assumed they did not belong. Childcare became a real issue, not an afterthought, because mothers were working shifts the war effort needed filled. Kaiser shipyards became associated not only with ship production, but with new approaches to worker healthcare and services, because keeping workers at their jobs became part of keeping the war machine running. There is something almost dizzying about this. A world war forced American employers and government officials to notice things they had previously treated as private household problems. If a woman could not work because there was nowhere for her child to go, that was no longer just her family's problem. It became a production problem. If workers were sick, housing was overcrowded, buses were late, or food service was disorganized, ships were delayed. War did not make American society fair, but it made certain forms of neglect inefficient, and inefficiency was harder to tolerate when the military wanted ships by a certain date. In factories and shipyards, speed became a national virtue. Posters told workers that every hour counted. Supervisors pushed output. Government films praised production. Newspapers celebrated records. There were ceremonies when ships launched, speeches when production milestones were reached, photographs of smiling workers beside machines larger than houses. But behind those public images were bodies under strain. Industrial work was tiring and dangerous. Welders burned their eyes. Riveters damaged their hearing. Machine operators risked fingers and hands. Workers inhaled fumes and dust. Long shifts wore people down. Housing shortages meant some workers slept in crowded rooms, trailers, converted spaces or temporary dormitories. The war economy paid wages, and those wages mattered deeply, but they were earned in heat, noise and repetition. This is where we should pause and think about Rosie the Riveter, because she's become so familiar that she is easy to misunderstand. The image now is bright and confident, a woman flexing her arm under a red bandana, turned into posters, shirts, mugs, and symbols of empowerment. But the real women of wartime industry were not slogans. They were tired people learning difficult work under pressure. They were mothers arranging childcare before dawn. They were young women leaving small towns for factories where the rules of behaviour, dress and independence felt new. They were wives whose husbands were overseas. They were black women who faced both sexism and racism in the hiring line. They were Mexican-American women, native women, immigrant daughters, widows, students, and former domestic workers. Some loved the wages and the pride. Some endured harassment. Some were praised in propaganda and then told after the war to give the jobs back. Their labour helped make American power, but the country did not always know what to do with the changes their labour revealed, and the machines they made were everywhere. The Jeep, small, rugged, simple and adaptable, became one of the icons of American mobility. Soldiers drove it through mud, sand, fields, ruined towns and mountain roads. It could tow, carry, scout and survive rough use. Trucks mattered even more. Armies do not move on courage alone. They move on tyres, fuel, axles, spare parts and drivers. One of the great advantages the United States gave the Allies was motor transport. American trucks helped armies move faster, supply lines stretch farther, and offensives continue when horse-drawn logistics would have slowed or failed. The Soviet Union received huge numbers of American trucks through Lend-Lease, and those vehicles helped give the Red Army mobility as it pushed westward. When people imagine the Eastern Front, they often picture tanks, artillery, snow, ruins, and infantry. But behind offensives were trucks carrying ammunition, food, fuel, and men. A truck built in an American factory could matter on a road outside Smolensk or Warsaw or Berlin. The tank factories told another part of the story. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler, became a major centre of tank production. Its creation showed how quickly American industry could move from civilian manufacturing to specialised military output. Tanks were not simply large metal boxes with guns. They required engines, transmissions, armour plate, optics, radios, tracks, suspensions and skilled assembly. They had to be produced in large numbers and maintained in the field. American tanks, especially the M4 Sherman, have been debated ever since by historians, veterans, and military enthusiasts. It was not the heaviest tank of the war, nor the most heavily armoured, but it was reliable, relatively easy to produce, adaptable, and available in enormous numbers. That mattered. A weapon that exists in theory as the best design is not as useful as a good enough weapon that can be built, shipped, fueled, repaired, and replaced. This was a central lesson of American wartime production. The United States did not have to make every individual machine superior to every enemy equivalent. It had to make enough effective machines to overwhelm the enemy's ability to respond. Quantity was not separate from quality. In modern industrial war, quantity became a quality of its own. A fighter plane, tank or ship that could be mass-produced reliably had strategic value beyond its individual specifications. Standardization allowed training, repair, spare parts, and supply to function at scale. American power grew not only from inventiveness, but from the ability to repeat. There were aircraft plants across the country, and the aircraft changed the geography of war. Boeing, Douglas, North American, consolidated. Grumman, Lockheed, and other companies produced bombers, fighters, transports, and naval aircraft. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the P-51 Mustang, the C-47 Transport, the F-6F Hellcat, and many other aircraft became part of the American and Allied war effort. Each represented not just engineering but production networks. Aluminum had to be mined, processed, and shaped. Engines had to be built with precision. Instruments had to work at altitude. Rubber, glass, copper wiring, radios, guns, oxygen systems, and thousands of smaller components had to arrive where they were needed. One missing part could halt production. One shortage could ripple through multiple plants. The war economy was a living system, and it had to be kept fed. The need for raw materials reached into ordinary life. Rubber became especially precious after Japan seized territory in Southeast Asia, where much of the world's natural rubber had been produced. Americans were asked to conserve tyres. Gasoline rationing was tied partly to rubber conservation, because less driving meant less tyre wear. Scrap drives collected metal, rubber, paper, and fats. Children brought old toys, pots, pans, and bits of metal to collection points. Some of the scrap drives were more useful for morale than for actual production, but morale mattered too. They made civilians feel connected to the war machine. They taught children that a bent piece of metal in a garage might somehow become part of victory. They made the home front visible to itself. Inside the great industrial conversion was an enormous financial conversion. The federal government spent at levels that would have been unthinkable before the war. Contracts flowed to corporations, taxes rose, war bonds were sold everywhere, promoted by movie stars, radio personalities, posters, schools, and local committees. Ordinary families bought bonds not only as investments but as acts of participation. A clerk, teacher, farmer, or factory worker could not command an army, but they could lend the government money. Bond drives turned finance into patriotism. They also helped manage inflation by drawing consumer money into government debt at a time when many civilian goods were scarce. Again and again, the war made private behaviour part of public strategy. This close relationship between government and business helped make the United States powerful, but it also raised questions that would outlive the war. Large corporations became deeply tied to federal contracts. Universities and laboratories became linked to military research. Industrial planning became normal during emergency. The federal government learned how to mobilize private capacity without fully nationalizing it. Business leaders learned that Washington could become their largest customer. Workers learned that government policy could affect wages, hiring, housing, and rights. The war did not turn America into a planned economy in the Soviet sense, but it created a mixed wartime system in which state power and private industry worked together at a scale the country had never seen before. That system would not disappear entirely after 1945. It would leave behind habits, institutions, expectations, and relationships that shaped the Cold War economy. There was also conflict inside this production miracle. Strikes did not vanish. Labour disputes continued, sometimes angrily, because workers were asked to give more while companies earned large contracts and prices rose. Many union leaders pledged not to strike during the war, but tensions remained. The government sometimes intervened to settle disputes or pressure both sides. Workers wanted fair wages and safe conditions. Employers wanted output and control. Military officials wanted supplies without delay. The public often judged strikes harshly during wartime, seeing them as threats to soldiers overseas, but the workers themselves knew that patriotism did not erase exhaustion, discrimination, or danger. The factories that changed the world were not peaceful little communities of shared purpose. They were workplaces with power struggles, resentments, pride, ambition, and fear. Race made those struggles sharper. Defence jobs attracted black workers, especially from the South. where Jim Crow laws and economic exploitation limited opportunity. The Second Great Migration accelerated during the war, as black families moved to cities such as Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, Oakland, Richmond, and many others. They came for work, wages, and the possibility of a different life. What they found was often both better and bitter. Wages could be higher than farm labour or domestic service. Industrial jobs could offer new skills and independence. But housing discrimination, segregated workplaces, racist violence and union barriers followed them. In 1943, Detroit erupted in a major race riot after months of tension over housing, jobs and segregation. This happened in the middle of the arsenal of democracy. That fact matters. The same city producing machines for freedom abroad was also exposing the limits of freedom at home. So when we say factories and shipyards made America powerful, we have to say it carefully. They made America powerful materially, but they also revealed who had been denied access to that power. The war economy opened doors, but often only under pressure. It praised unity, but did not create equality. It needed labour so urgently that it sometimes made reforms possible, but those reforms were contested at every step. The machines changed everything, partly because the people building them changed the country simply by showing up and demanding a place inside the work. By 1943 and 1944, the results were visible everywhere. American production flooded the war. The United States built tens of thousands of aircraft, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of tanks and armoured vehicles, millions of rifles and small arms, vast numbers of trucks, and mountains of ammunition and supplies. The numbers are so large that they can become meaningless if we let them. So let us make them smaller for a moment. A crate of canned food loaded onto a ship, a pair of boots issued to a soldier, a radio installed in a tank, a landing craft built in a yard and sent toward a beach, a transport plane carrying paratroopers, a bomber crew climbing into an aircraft assembled by workers they would never meet, a nurse opening a box of medical supplies made in a plant far from the front, a Soviet driver starting an American-built truck in freezing weather, a British unit using American equipment after years of strain. That is what the numbers meant. They meant things arrived. Arriving was often the difference between a plan and a disaster. Logistics rarely receive the attention that combat does, but they are the skeleton of military power. The United States became powerful because it could connect factory to port, port to convoy, convoy to depot, depot to army, army to battlefield. It could keep the chain moving across oceans. This required railroads, warehouses, cranes, stevedores, sailors, clerks, mechanics, quartermasters, and an ocean of forms and schedules. Every landing operation, every offensive, every bombing campaign depended on the boring miracle of supply. The glamour of victory stood on paperwork and cargo handling. And somewhere in all of this, the American sense of itself began to change. During the Depression, the country had seen idleness, waste, and failure. During the war, it saw motion, output, and necessity. The same nation that had wondered whether its economic system could provide work now watched unemployment collapse under the pressure of wartime demand. The same government that had experimented with relief and recovery now commanded production priorities and directed resources. The same workers who had doubted their place in the economy now found themselves told that their labour was essential to victory. This did not erase the pain of the 1930s, but it changed the national mood. Americans could see evidence of capability everywhere. In the ships launched, the planes completed, the paychecks earned, the bond totals announced, the military victories gradually arriving from overseas. There is a danger in telling this story too proudly. Production power can sound clean from a distance. It can become a list of achievements, a celebration of output, a patriotic mural painted over the human cost. But if we keep our eyes close to the ground, the story becomes more honest and more interesting. It is not only that America built machines, It is that Americans reorganized daily life around building them. A family dinner changed because shifts changed. A town changed because workers arrived. A marriage changed because a woman earned her own wages. A union changed because its members were now essential to national survival. A black family changed because a defense job offered a way out of agricultural poverty, even if racism waited in the city. A child changed because their mother worked nights and their father was overseas. A factory changed because its old products vanished and its new products would be used by people fighting for their lives. By the time the production system reached full strength, American power was no longer sleeping or half-formed. It was moving on rails and roads, across assembly lines and ocean routes, into depots and onto ships. It was stamped into metal plates, packed in crates, written into contracts, and shouted over factory noise. It was not yet the whole story of why the United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful country on earth, but it was one of the foundations. Without the factories, the armies would have lacked tools. Without the shipyards, the tools would have stayed home. Without the workers, the machines would have remained drawings. Without the government's pressure and money, private industry would not have transformed fast enough. Without the raw materials and transportation networks, production would have choked on its own ambition. The war turned American industry into a kind of national muscle, and once that muscle had been exercised at full force, the rest of the world could not ignore it. Allies depended on it. Enemies feared it. American leaders learned from it. Workers lived inside it. And the soldiers and sailors moving toward the fighting fronts carried it with them in every vehicle, every ration tin, every landing craft, every radio, every engine, every weapon, every spare part packed behind the front lines. The machines built at home were about to become movement overseas, and movement overseas meant the next stage of American power would not stay inside the factory gates. It would board trains, enter ports, cross oceans, and place millions of Americans into a war that was no longer distant, no longer theoretical, and no longer something the country could supply from the safety of home alone. The machines built at home were about to become movement overseas, and movement overseas meant the next stage of American power would not stay inside the factory gates. It would board trains, enter ports, cross oceans, and place millions of Americans into a war that was no longer distant, no longer theoretical, and no longer something the country could supply from the safety of home alone. The United States had built the tanks, trucks, ships, aircraft, radios, uniforms, rifles, and crates of food, but now all of it had to be carried into a world already torn apart. That required soldiers, sailors, pilots, nurses, engineers, dock workers, merchant mariners, clerks, mechanics, drivers, cooks, radio operators, construction battalions, and supply officers. It required people who rarely appeared in the heroic paintings of war, but whose work made the heroic moments possible. Think about the size of the problem for a moment. The United States was separated from the main fighting fronts by oceans. That had protected the country in the past, but now it became a challenge. An army in Europe needed to be moved across the Atlantic. A navy in the Pacific needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, medicine, aircraft, and replacement crews across thousands of miles of water. A soldier could not simply be sent to the front with a rifle and courage. He needed boots, socks, blankets, helmets, letters, maps, training, transport, pay records, medical care, mail service, food, water, ammunition, and some way to be evacuated if he was wounded. Every man at the front was connected to a long chain of labour behind him, and the chain stretched all the way back to the American home front. This is where American power became visible in a new way. It was not only the power to make things, it was the power to move them. That sounds simple until you try to imagine the scale of it. A truck built in Detroit had to be transported by rail to a port, loaded onto a ship protected in convoy, unloaded in Britain, assigned to a unit, fueled, maintained, and driven through roads that might be bombed, muddy, crowded, or ruined. A crate of canned meat might begin in a packing plant, pass through warehouses, ports, ships, depots, and field kitchens, before finally reaching a soldier who did not know, and probably did not have the energy to care, how many hands had touched it before it reached his mess kit. An aircraft engine could cross half the world before it was bolted into a plane. A radio tube, a tyre, a medical kit, a box of morphine, a bundle of maps, a landing craft part, each had its own journey. Modern war was not one road. It was millions of roads running at once. The men who entered the armed forces carried that system with them, even when they did not see all of it. After Pearl Harbor, enlistment offices filled, but enlistment alone could not produce the numbers required. The draft expanded the military until the United States had millions in uniform. These were not all professional soldiers. Many were clerks, farmers, students, mechanics, shop assistants, coal miners, teachers, factory hands, sons of immigrants, sons of old American families, men from cities, men from rural counties, men who had barely travelled beyond their state, and men who had already lived hard lives during the Depression. The war took them, sorted them, shaved their heads, issued uniforms, gave them numbers, assigned them to units, and began turning civilians into parts of a global military machine. Training was often the first shock. A young man from a quiet farm might find himself in a camp with thousands of strangers, standing in formation, learning to march, clean weapons, follow orders, handle exhaustion, and live without privacy. A city boy who had never slept outdoors might be taught to crawl through mud under live fire. Men who had worked alone or with family now had to learn that survival depended on people whose accents, religions, habits, and backgrounds were different from their own. The military became one of the largest mixing places in American life, though not an equal one. The armed forces were still segregated for most of the war. Black troops served in separate units, often denied the same opportunities for combat roles, promotion, training, and respect given to white soldiers. They wore the same country's uniform, but they did not receive the same country's treatment. That contradiction followed the United States overseas. Black soldiers drove trucks, built roads, handled supplies, served in engineer units, medical units, port battalions, and combat units that had to fight for recognition as well as against the enemy. The Tuskegee Airmen proved themselves in the air. The 761st Tank Battalion fought in Europe. Black stevedores and quartermaster troops helped to keep supplies moving in ports and depots, where the war effort depended on work that was physically exhausting and often overlooked. Many of these men understood the double meaning of their service. They were fighting fascism abroad while facing segregation at home and inside the very institution that claimed to defend democracy. Their presence overseas made American power larger, but their treatment revealed how incomplete American democracy still was. White soldiers also carried private burdens into the war. Some came from families that had barely recovered from the Depression. Some had never known steady security. Some were afraid of failing in front of other men. Some believed strongly in the cause. Some simply went because the draft notice came, and there was no real choice. We sometimes talk about wartime unity as if every person moved with the same conviction. Real life was messier. A man could hate Hitler and still be terrified. He could believe Japan had to be defeated and still dread the Pacific. He could be proud to serve and homesick every night. He could write cheerful letters to his mother and say nothing about what he had seen. The war made citizens into instruments of national power, but it did not make them less human. The sailors carried America differently. They lived inside the moving infrastructure of the war. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, aircraft carriers, transports, cargo ships, tankers, repair vessels, hospital ships, and landing craft turned oceans into working space. A sailor might spend weeks seeing nothing but water, sky, steel, and the same tired faces. He might sleep in cramped quarters where the air smelled of oil, sweat, paint and machinery. He might stand watch in cold Atlantic spray, or in Pacific heat so heavy it made metal surfaces burn the skin. The Navy's power depended not only on great battles, but on constant operation. Ships had to be maintained, refueled, repaired, and protected. Convoys had to stay together. Signals had to be read correctly. Engines had to keep running. A mistake in darkness or fog could kill as surely as enemy fire. The Battle of the Atlantic was one of the clearest examples of this kind of hidden struggle. German submarines hunted Allied shipping because they understood that Britain, and later the American build-up in Europe, depended on supplies crossing the ocean. Merchant ships carried the food, fuel, tanks, trucks, ammunition, and troops that made everything else possible. The sailors of the US Navy and the merchant mariners who crewed cargo vessels faced danger that could arrive without warning. A torpedo strike did not give a man much time to think. One moment there was routine, the next there was explosion, black water, fire, listing decks, and the sudden knowledge that the ocean did not care how far from home you were. The merchant marine suffered heavily during the war, and yet its role is still often pushed to the edges of memory. Without those ships and those crews, American production would have remained trapped in American warehouses. The merchant mariner was not always seen like a soldier, but he carried a soldier's risk. He might be transporting fuel, explosives, food, trucks, or aircraft parts through waters where submarines were waiting. He might not wear the same uniform or receive the same recognition, but if his ship went down, the danger was just as real. Convoys moved slowly because they had to protect the slowest ships. Sailors watched for periscopes, aircraft, floating mines, and signals. Destroyers zigzagged around merchant vessels. Escorts dropped depth charges. Men learned to sleep lightly because alarms could sound at any hour. This was not the grand image of war that fills posters. It was waiting, watching, freezing, sweating, and doing ordinary tasks under the knowledge that the next minute could split the ship open. Across the Pacific, distance became an even greater enemy. The Pacific War was fought across a vast ocean scattered with islands, bases, reefs, jungles, and airfields. The Japanese Empire had expanded across thousands of miles, and American forces had to move step by step through that space. Every landing required planning, every base had to be supplied, every aircraft needed fuel and maintenance, every wounded man had to be treated and moved, every island captured became part of a chain that allowed the next operation to happen. The phrase island hopping can sound almost casual, as if the military simply skipped from one dot on a map to another. In reality, each move required ships, landing craft, naval gunfire, air cover, engineers, medical units, supply dumps, and men willing to step off landing craft into machine gun fire, coral, surf, mud, and heat. The Marines became central to many of those Pacific landings, and their battles entered American memory with a force that remained strong. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. But behind the images of Marines raising flags or moving across beaches was a support system so large that it almost disappears from view. Navy Seabees, the construction battalions, built airstrips, roads, piers, storage facilities, hospitals and camps in places where infrastructure had been destroyed or had never existed in the form the war required. They could land after combat troops and begin turning damaged ground into a functioning base. They were builders under military conditions, and their work mattered because American power overseas could not remain a temporary landing. It had to become a usable position. Engineers did similar work in Europe. They built bridges, cleared mines, repaired roads, opened ports, laid pipelines, and kept armies moving through terrain damaged by bombing and retreating forces. After D-Day, Allied armies in France depended on the flow of supplies from beaches and later from ports. The invasion of Normandy itself was not simply a landing. It was a logistical operation of extraordinary complexity. Men, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and communications had to be delivered across the English Channel, under threat of weather, enemy fire, and confusion. Artificial harbours, known as mulberries, were built to help unload supplies before major ports were captured. Pipelines were laid to move fuel, roads became crowded with vehicles, military police directed traffic, supply officers calculated needs, while combat commanders demanded more of everything. D-Day is often remembered through the first waves, the landing craft approaching, the soldiers stepping into water, the gunfire, the obstacles, the cliffs, the beach. That memory is right to honour the men who faced those first hours. But the larger operation did not end when men reached the sand. In some ways, that was when another kind of battle began. The beachhead had to be fed. A force that lands and cannot be supplied is not an invasion. It is a disaster waiting to happen. The United States and its allies succeeded not only because men fought their way ashore, but because supplies kept arriving after them. The power of America overseas was measured in the ability to continue after the dramatic moment had passed. This ability became even more important as Allied armies broke out of Normandy and moved across France. The faster they advanced, the harder it became to supply them. Trucks had to drive longer distances from ports and depots. Fuel consumption rose, roads became clogged. Tyres wore down. Drivers pushed through exhaustion. One of the best-known efforts was the Red Ball Express, a massive trucking operation that moved supplies to advancing armies after the Normandy breakout. Many of its drivers were black soldiers, working long hours on dangerous roads, often under difficult conditions and without the public attention given to frontline combat units. They carried gasoline, ammunition, food, and other necessities forward, so the advance could continue. Their work shows something essential about the war. Movement depended on drivers as much as generals. A tank without fuel was a metal shelter. A gun without shells was a heavy tube. A soldier without food could not fight for long. A field hospital without supplies could not save the wounded. The people who carried American power overseas were not only the ones who attacked, they were also the ones who made sure attacking remained possible after the first day. This is why the American military became so difficult for its enemies to match. It could project force far from home and keep feeding that force. It could absorb losses and continue. It could send fresh units, fresh equipment, fresh supplies. That did not make victory easy. It did make the United States a new kind of global actor. There were also the nurses, doctors, medics, and hospital workers who carried another side of American power, the ability to preserve life within a system built for destruction. American nurses served in field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, station hospitals, and aboard hospital ships. They worked near combat zones, under pressure, often with overwhelming numbers of wounded. The wounded arrived dirty, bleeding, burned, shocked, sometimes silent, sometimes crying out, sometimes still wearing pieces of the battlefield on their bodies. A nurse might change dressings, prepare men for surgery, comfort the dying, write letters, manage exhaustion, and then do the same again the next day. Medical care had improved since earlier wars. An evacuation system saved many lives, but the work was still intimate and terrible. The fact that American forces could treat, evacuate, and return men to care was part of military strength. It reminded soldiers that they belonged to a system that would try to bring them back. The mail system mattered too, in a quieter way. Letters moved between home and front in vast quantities. V-mail reduced letters to microfilm to save cargo space, then printed them again closer to delivery. That seems like a small technical detail until you imagine a soldier reading his mother's handwriting after weeks of mud or fear, or a wife opening a letter from a man whose location had been censored, but whose voice still reached the kitchen table. Morale was not decoration. It helped armies endure. The United States carried emotional supply overseas along with material supply. A man who received mail knew he had not vanished from the world he was fighting for. The soldiers overseas also carried American culture with them. They brought cigarettes, chewing gum, slang, swing music, baseball talk, comic books, magazines, and habits that foreign civilians noticed quickly. In Britain, American G's sometimes seemed loud, rich, informal, and overpaid, compared with local soldiers and civilians enduring years of rationing and bombing. The phrase used by some British people was that the Americans were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It was a joke, but it pointed to real tensions. American troops arrived with money in their pockets, better supplies in many cases, and a confidence that could be charming or irritating depending on the situation. They were representatives of a country becoming powerful faster than it understood how to be graceful about it. In liberated areas, American soldiers could be greeted with relief, curiosity, suspicion, or all three. To a French child seeing a GI hand out chocolate, America might look generous and almost impossibly abundant. To an older civilian whose town had been bombed in the fighting, liberation could feel complicated, grateful and painful at once. In the Pacific, the encounter between American troops and local populations was shaped by empire, racism, language barriers, and the extreme brutality of the war against Japan. American power overseas did not move through empty space. It moved through other people's homes, farms, ports, streets, and ruins. The workers overseas deserve attention, because they were often not fighting in the usual sense. But they made the fighting sustainable. Civilian contractors, Red Cross workers, war correspondents, entertainers, mechanics, technicians and engineers followed the expanding reach of American operations. USO performers brought music, comedy and familiarity to troops far from home. War correspondents reported from the front, shaping how Americans understood the conflict. Mechanics kept aircraft flying and vehicles running. Signal units maintained communications. Clerks tracked records that could determine pay, replacements, supplies and casualties. The war created a moving American world beyond America's borders, a world of tents, depots, airfields, mess lines, repair shops, command posts, chapels, hospitals and temporary offices. Airmen carried American power in a way that was both technologically impressive and morally heavy. The United States Army Air Forces expanded rapidly during the war, sending bomber crews over Europe and later over Japan. Young men trained as pilots, navigators, bombardiers, radio operators, gunners, and mechanics. A heavy bomber crew lived with odds that could be grim, especially in the earlier phases of the air war over Europe. Missions meant cold, flak, fighters, oxygen masks, fear, and long hours in machines that were powerful but vulnerable. The strategic bombing campaign was intended to weaken enemy industry, transportation, and morale, but it also killed civilians in large numbers. American air power became one of the clearest signs that the United States could reach deep into enemy territory. It was also one of the clearest examples of how modern power could become morally complicated. The same country that had once hoped to stay out of war was now sending aircraft across continents and oceans. It had moved from reluctance to global reach in only a few years. That speed changed how American leaders saw the future. If the United States could build bases, supply forces, coordinate allies, and conduct operations across the planet during war, then perhaps its security after the war would also require a permanent global presence. This was a major shift. Before the war, many Americans had believed safety came from staying apart. During the war, they learned that safety might require being everywhere, but the people living inside that lesson were not thinking in those terms every day. A soldier in Italy was thinking about the next hill, the next meal, the next letter. A sailor in the Pacific was thinking about heat, watch duty, and whether enemy aircraft would appear. A nurse in France was thinking about the men arriving faster than beds could be cleared. A truck driver on the Red Ball Express was thinking about staying awake and keeping the convoy moving. A Seabee was thinking about getting the airstrip ready before more planes arrived. A merchant mariner was thinking about the dark water beyond the convoy lights. They were carrying American power, but they experienced it as work, danger, routine, boredom, homesickness, and sudden terror. There is something important in that contrast. Nations become powerful in history books, but people become tired in real time. The great movement of American strength overseas depended on millions of small acts performed by people who did not feel grand while doing them. A sailor tightening a valve, a cook preparing food for hundreds of men, a mechanic replacing a part in bad weather, a driver checking tyres, a medic cleaning instruments, a clerk updating casualty records, a pilot studying maps, a soldier cleaning mud from a weapon. These were not separate from power, they were power at the level of the hand. By 1944 and 1945, the reach of the United States had become unmistakable. American troops were in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, China, Burma, India, and many other places connected to the wider conflict. American ships crossed the oceans in constant movement. American aircraft operated from bases spread across the world. American supplies fed Allied armies. American money financed enormous operations. American commanders sat at the table with British and Soviet leaders planning the defeat of Axis powers and the shape of what might follow. The country that had once debated whether to involve itself in the war was now one of the central forces deciding how the war would be fought. And still, none of this happened by strength alone. It happened because strength was organised. The soldiers needed ships. The ships needed fuel. The fuel needed oil fields, refineries, tankers and pipelines. The tanks needed steel. The steel needed mines, mills, railroads and workers. The aircraft needed aluminum, rubber, instruments and trained crews. The armies needed money, food, contracts and administration. The military reach of the United States was inseparable from the economic foundation beneath it. A rifle in a soldier's hands was connected to a factory budget. A landing craft in the surf was connected to steel production. A convoy at sea was connected to oil, insurance, shipbuilding, naval escorts and port labour. The human chain overseas rested on a material chain at home. That is where the story has to move next. Because the soldiers, sailors, nurses, drivers, pilots, engineers, merchant crews and workers carried American power across the world. But what they carried was made possible by something deeper than uniforms and courage. Beneath the movement of men and machines were the resources that made the United States different from every exhausted power it fought beside and against. Oil that kept engines moving, steel that became ships and tanks, food that fed armies and allies, money that flowed through bonds, banks, contracts and global agreements. The war did not only prove that America could fight, it proved that America could finance, fuel and supply a world war while its own homeland remained physically intact, and that fact would matter long after the last troopship came home. The war did not only prove that America could fight, it proved that America could finance, fuel and supply a world war while its own homeland remained physically intact, and that fact would matter long after the last troopship came home. This is where American power becomes less visible for a moment, but more important. It moves out of the rifle, the ship, the airplane and the uniform, and into things that sound less dramatic until you understand what they made possible. Money, oil, steel, food, contracts, taxes, railroads, pipelines, cargo space, and credit. These were not background details. They were the deep structure of victory. They were the reason a country thousands of miles from the main battlefields could keep sending force across the planet while other nations were being bombed, occupied, starved, bankrupted, or drained white by the demands of survival. If you want to understand why World War II made the United States the most powerful country on Earth, you have to spend some time with these materials and systems. Not because they are glamorous. They are not. There is nothing especially dramatic about a refinery schedule, a steel allocation order, a treasury bond drive, or a freight car full of wheat. But modern power rarely announces itself only with flags. It often appears first in ledgers, storage tanks, blast furnaces, shipping manifests, and bank accounts. A government can promise victory in a speech, but if it cannot pay its workers, fuel its ships, build its weapons, and feed its armies, the speech eventually becomes only sound. The United States could do those things on a scale that no other country could match by the middle of the war, and that changed not only the outcome of the fighting, but the shape of the world that came after. Start with money, because every wartime decision eventually passed through it. Wars are expensive in a way that ordinary citizens almost never see directly. A single rifle has a cost, a tank has a cost, a bomber has a cost, a ship has a cost. So does training a soldier, feeding him, moving him, paying him, treating him if he is wounded, replacing his equipment and bringing him home if he survives. Multiply that by millions of people in uniform, then add shipyards, factories, research laboratories, military bases, hospitals, ports, airfields, fuel, food, ammunition, and aid to allies, and you begin to see why finance was not separate from fighting. It was part of the fighting. Before the war, federal spending had already grown because of the New Deal, but wartime spending moved into an entirely different world. The government became the largest buyer in American life. It bought ships before they touched water, aircraft before they flew, uniforms before they were worn, bullets before they were fired, and food before it reached soldiers' mess kits. It signed contracts with major corporations and smaller suppliers. It borrowed. It taxed. It sold bonds. It asked ordinary Americans to think of saving money not only as a private habit, but as a patriotic duty. A child buying a 10-cent savings stamp at school was participating in the same financial system that funded factories and armies. That is one of the strange things about total war. It turns small gestures into pieces of a national mechanism. War bonds became part of everyday culture. Posters appeared in store windows and post offices. Movie stars appeared at rallies. Radio programs encouraged listeners to buy. Schools held drives. Employers set up payroll deduction plans. Neighbourhood committees kept track of participation. The language was direct. Buying bonds helped the boys overseas. It helped buy planes, tanks, ships, and guns. It turned money that might have chased scarce consumer goods into loans to the government. That mattered because wartime America had a problem that came with full employment and limited civilian production. People were earning wages, sometimes better wages than they had ever earned, but many of the things they might have bought in peacetime were unavailable or rationed. New cars were not being produced for civilians. Tyres were restricted. Gasoline was rationed. Many household appliances disappeared from stores because factories had converted to war production. If too much money chased too few goods, prices could rise dangerously. Bonds helped absorb that money while giving families a sense that they were doing something useful. Taxes changed too. The federal income tax, which had once touched a smaller share of Americans, expanded dramatically during the war. The Revenue Act of 1942 brought millions more people into the income tax system, and payroll withholding began soon after, making tax collection more regular and automatic. This was one of those changes that sounds administrative but reshaped the relationship between Americans and the federal government. Before the war, many people did not experience Washington so directly in their paychecks. During the war, the government became present in wages, prices, ration books, production rules, bonds, draft notices, and taxes. American power grew partly because the federal government learned to collect and direct resources at a national scale, and Americans, under the pressure of war, accepted a level of federal reach that would have been far harder to imagine in ordinary times. There was a deeper financial shift happening beneath all of this. Britain, once the great financial centre of the world, was being exhausted by the war. It had spent heavily, borrowed heavily, and sold assets to keep fighting. European economies were under bombing, occupation, blockade, or military strain. The Soviet Union was suffering destruction on a scale almost beyond language. Japan was stretched across an empire it could not fully sustain. Germany controlled much of Europe. but its economy was under enormous pressure and depended on plunder, forced labour, and increasingly desperate resource management. The United States, by contrast, was spending heavily but also expanding production. Its factories were not being bombed, its farms were not being invaded, its major cities were not being reduced to rubble. Its financial system remained intact. It could borrow from its own citizens and still produce more. It could lend and lease supplies abroad while building its own forces. That combination was extraordinary. Lend-Lease showed this clearly. When the United States sent aid to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies, it was not simply sending spare goods, it was using its economic strength as a weapon. American trucks, locomotives, food, raw materials, aircraft, fuel, and industrial equipment helped keep Allied countries in the fight. The value was not only in the objects themselves, but in what they allowed others to do. A Soviet army supplied with American trucks could move more effectively. Britain receiving American food and equipment could survive longer and fight harder. China, though often undersupplied compared with other fronts, still received American assistance that reflected the global reach of the American supply effort. The United States became the country whose production could appear in other nations' armies. That is a special kind of power. It means your strength multiplies through others. Now move from money to oil, because without oil the machines stop. This is easy to forget because oil is so ordinary in modern life that it hides in plain sight. But World War II was a fuel war. Tanks needed fuel, trucks needed fuel, aircraft needed aviation gasoline, ships needed fuel oil. Submarines, landing craft, generators, construction equipment, ambulances and supply vehicles all depended on petroleum in one form or another. A modern army could not live only on courage and rifles. It had to move, and movement burned fuel. The United States entered the war with enormous petroleum advantages. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, Louisiana and elsewhere were among the most productive in the world. Refineries could process crude into gasoline, diesel, lubricants, aviation fuel, and other essential products. The United States also had access to oil from the Western Hemisphere, including Venezuela, and it had the industrial capacity to refine and transport petroleum at huge scale. This mattered more than almost any dramatic battlefield scene can show. A nation with oil can keep engines running. A nation without enough oil begins making choices that limit strategy. Japan knew this. Germany knew this. Britain knew this. Everyone knew it. Japan's decision to expand southward in 1941 was tied directly to resources, especially oil. American embargoes and restrictions put pressure on Japan's ability to continue its war in China and sustain its military. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was connected to a wider strategy that included seizing resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia, including the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The war in the Pacific was not only about territory and pride, it was about fuel, rubber, tin, and the materials needed to keep an empire functioning. Japan won early victories and captured resources, but it faced a longer problem, protecting shipping lanes across a vast ocean while the United States built more ships, submarines, aircraft, and bases. Oil captured on a map still had to be transported. Tankers could be sunk, refineries could be bombed, routes could be cut. Resource possession was not the same as resource security. Germany faced its own fuel problems. It had coal and synthetic fuel production, but not enough natural petroleum to fight the kind of long mechanized war it had begun. Romanian oil fields at Ploiești became vital to the German war effort, and Allied bombing targeted them. German armies needed fuel for tanks, trucks, aircraft and industry. As the war turned against Germany, shortages grew worse. By the later stages of the war, fuel scarcity limited training, movement and operations. A powerful tank that cannot be fueled is a burden. A fighter plane that cannot fly is decoration. A strategy that depends on movement collapses when the fuel runs out. The United States had the opposite problem. Not that oil was easy, but that it had enough production capacity to turn oil into global movement. Even then, moving oil was difficult. Tankers were vulnerable to submarines. Coastal shipping was dangerous, especially early in the war when German U-boats operated off the American East Coast and in the Caribbean. Pipelines became crucial. The Big Inch and Little Big Inch pipelines were built to carry oil and refined products from Texas toward the East Coast, reducing dependence on vulnerable tanker routes. This was another example of infrastructure becoming strategy. A pipeline did not look like a battle, but it answered a battlefield problem. It moved fuel where it was needed while reducing the number of ships exposed to attack. Aviation fuel deserves special attention because air power was one of the defining features of the war. High-performance aircraft required high-quality fuel. The production of 100-octane aviation gasoline gave Allied aircraft important performance advantages. Refineries, chemical plants, and oil companies were part of this story as much as pilots. A fighter plane's speed and climb depended not only on design and pilot skill, but on the fuel burned inside its engine. A bomber's range and reliability depended on petroleum chemistry. The air war, so often imagined as pilots in goggles and oxygen masks, rested on refinery workers, engineers, pipeline crews, tanker crews, and chemists. Oil also connected to the home front in visible ways. Gasoline rationing changed civilian life. Drivers received ration stickers and coupons. Pleasure driving was discouraged or restricted. Tyres were conserved because rubber was scarce. People shared rides, used public transportation more often, and planned trips carefully. The government did not ration gasoline only because there was no gasoline at all. It rationed because fuel, rubber and transportation capacity had to be directed toward war needs. Ordinary Americans felt global strategy in the simple question of whether they could drive somewhere. A family that once took Sunday drives now had to think twice. A farmer, doctor, war worker, or delivery driver might receive different allowances based on need. The war made energy policy personal. Steel formed the next pillar. If oil moved the war, steel gave it shape. Steel became ships, tanks, trucks, guns, shells, helmets, landing craft, rail lines, bridges, aircraft parts, tools, and factory machines. It was everywhere. The United States had major steel production centered in places such as Pittsburgh, Gary, Cleveland, Bethlehem, and other industrial regions. Iron ore moved from the Mesabi Range and other sources through Great Lakes shipping and rail networks. Coal-fed furnaces, scrap drives brought in old metal, partly to support production and partly to make civilians feel directly involved. Steel mills ran under enormous demand, and allocation became a constant issue because every service and industry wanted more. There is a particular kind of heat in a steel mill that is hard to understand from a distance. Men worked near furnaces, molten metal, rolling equipment, cranes, and noise that filled the body. Steel did not simply appear because the country needed it. It was made by labour that was dangerous, skilled, and exhausting. The armour plate on a tank, the hull of a Liberty ship, the barrel of a gun, the rails carrying freight toward ports, all of it began somewhere with workers under heat and pressure. American industrial power rested on those bodies as much as on corporate charts and government plans. The War Production Board had to decide how steel and other materials would be distributed. Civilian construction was limited. Consumer goods were reduced or stopped. Manufacturers could not simply use metal as they wished. A company that wanted steel needed priority ratings and approvals. This was not normal peacetime business. It was a national sorting process. Who needed steel most urgently? A shipyard, a tank plant, a railroad, a munitions factory, a pipeline project. Every decision had consequences. Too little steel in one place could delay ships. Too little in another could slow tank production. Too much given to less urgent uses could weaken the whole war effort. Materials management became one of the hidden arts of the conflict. Steel also tells us something about why America emerged stronger than other powers. Germany had a formidable industrial base, but Allied bombing, resource shortages, labour problems, and the demands of multiple fronts placed severe limits on what it could do. The Soviet Union performed a remarkable industrial relocation, moving factories eastward and producing huge quantities of weapons under terrible conditions. But much of its territory had been devastated, and its human losses were catastrophic. Britain produced heroically under bombing and strain, but it depended increasingly on American support. Japan had skilled industry but lacked the raw materials, shipping security and production scale to match the United States over time. The United States could expand production while remaining physically safe at home. That was one of the decisive facts of the war. Food should be included here too, because food is power in its most basic form. American farms produced for civilians, soldiers, and allies. Wheat, corn, meat, dairy, canned goods, dried eggs, powdered milk, and many other products moved through the war system. Farmers were asked to produce more despite labour shortages caused by the draft and industrial migration. Women, older men, teenagers, migrant labourers, prisoners of war and temporary workers all helped keep agriculture functioning. Victory gardens allowed civilians to supplement food supplies and feel part of the effort. Rationing shaped kitchens and grocery lists. Sugar, meat, butter, coffee, and canned goods were controlled at different times. Food was not only a household concern, it was diplomatic, military, and economic. A country that can feed armies and allies has leverage. A country that cannot feed its people is vulnerable no matter how many speeches its leaders give. The United States fed not only its own troops but also helped feed allied nations. This mattered especially because war disrupts agriculture. Fields become battlefields. Farmers are drafted, railways are destroyed, livestock is lost, cities are blockaded, occupying armies seize food, hunger weakens morale, labour, military strength and political stability. American food shipments were part of keeping allies functioning. The full stomach of a soldier, a factory worker, or a civilian in an allied country was connected to American agricultural abundance. Again, this was not sentimental generosity alone. It was strategy. Food keeps coal miners working, soldiers marching, children alive, and governments from collapsing under despair. All of these things came together in the new shape of global strength. Before World War II, many people still imagined power in older terms. Colonies, battleships, armies, gold reserves, and borders. Those things still mattered, but the war showed that the strongest country was the one that could coordinate resources across systems. It needed money to buy and build, oil to move, steel to construct, food to sustain, science to innovate, industry to produce, ships to transport, administration to manage, alliances to extend influence. The United States did not possess every advantage alone, and it depended on allies in crucial ways. But by the later years of the war, it had combined these forms of strength more effectively than anyone else. This is why Bretton Woods matters. In July 1944, while the war was still being fought, representatives from Allied nations met in New Hampshire to plan the post-war financial order. That meeting helped create the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and it placed the US dollar at the centre of the new system, linked to gold while other currencies were linked to the dollar. That sounds technical, but it was a sign of a world already changing. The United States was not simply planning how to win battles, it was helping design the financial rules of the peace. Britain had once been the central banker of the world through the power of the pound and the City of London. After the war, that position would shift decisively toward the United States. The dollar became the key currency of the new order because America had the gold, the production, the stability, and the economic weight to support it. Imagine how that looked from the outside. Europe was still fighting, cities were damaged, governments were displaced or strained, armies were moving across the continent, millions were dead or uprooted. Yet in a hotel in New Hampshire, officials were discussing exchange rates, reconstruction, lending, and global stability after the war. That is a quiet form of power. It means you're strong enough not only to survive the present crisis, but to plan the rules that others may have to live under afterward. The United States could do that because its war was not being fought through the ruins of its own cities. Its conference rooms were safe. Its banks operated. Its railroads ran. Its farms produced. Its factories expanded. Its officials could imagine post-war order, while other countries were still trying to avoid collapse. This did not mean Americans felt untouched. They had lost sons, brothers, husbands, wives, friends and neighbours. Casualty lists were real. Telegrams arrived. Families grieved. Men came home wounded in body and mind. But the national territory itself had not been destroyed. That distinction mattered enormously. A mother in Illinois might lose a son in Europe, and her grief was complete. But the town around her was still standing. The factory still operated. The bank still opened. The school still taught. The roads and bridges still functioned. In Poland, France, the Soviet Union, Germany, China, the Philippines, and many other places, war had entered the streets, homes, farms, and bodies of civilians in a far more direct physical way. The United States suffered, but it did not suffer destruction at home on the scale that reshaped other nations' futures. Because of that, American wealth after the war was not just wealth earned during conflict. It was wealth preserved while others were ruined. That is a hard sentence, but it is necessary. The United States did not become powerful only because it was virtuous or brave or inventive, though bravery and invention were certainly part of the story. It became powerful because the war destroyed or exhausted many competitors while expanding American productive capacity. Factories built for war could later be adapted. Workers had skills. Corporations had grown. The federal government had learned how to manage huge systems. The dollar had gained centrality. The military had built bases and networks around the world. American leaders had relationships with allied governments. The country had become used to thinking globally. There were tensions in this new strength. Wartime contracts made some corporations far larger and more influential. Workers who had earned good wages feared post-war layoffs. Women who had proven themselves in factories were told many of their jobs belonged to returning men. Black veterans and workers returned to a country still marked by segregation and discrimination. Farmers wondered what would happen when wartime demand changed. Taxpayers had grown used to the enormous cost of war, but not necessarily to what peace would require. The United States had gained power, but power created obligations and conflicts. It would have to decide whether to retreat again or remain engaged. The war had made retreat harder. At the ground level, these vast changes still appeared in ordinary forms. A refinery worker in Texas might not have thought about Bretton Woods while checking equipment. A steel worker in Pennsylvania might not have imagined the dollar becoming the backbone of a financial order while finishing a shift. A farmer in Iowa might not have seen himself as part of global power while loading grain. A woman buying war bonds from her paycheck might not have connected her small deduction to the future of American credit. A truck driver hauling fuel might not have considered that oil would define military reach for decades. Yet all of them were inside the same structure. Their labour, savings, production, and discipline helped make the United States not only a wartime force, but a post-war power. That is what makes this stage of the story so important. Battles decided territory. Production decided endurance. Finance decided scale. Oil decided movement. Steel decided form. Food decided survival. Together they created a kind of strength that did not end when the shooting stopped. A tank could be parked, a soldier could be discharged, a ship could be mothballed, but a financial system, an industrial base, a global supply network, a military planning culture, and a belief that American security was tied to world order could not be packed away so easily. The war had taught the United States to operate as the central engine of a global coalition. Once a country learns that role, and once others begin depending on it, returning to the old posture becomes much more difficult. By 1945, the results of this deep power were becoming impossible to miss. American troops were advancing with allies into Germany. In the Pacific, American forces were closing in on Japan through brutal island campaigns and air attacks. Allied leaders were meeting to discuss borders, occupation zones, reparations, elections, and the future of Europe. The United States arrived at those meetings with armies in the field, fleets at sea, aircraft in the sky, factories at home, credit in reserve, and a homeland untouched by the level of physical ruin visible across much of the world. That gave American leaders a voice they had never had before. It also placed them in a world where the old powers were weaker, the Soviet Union was stronger but devastated, and the question of who would shape the peace was no longer theoretical. To see why America stood so tall at the end, we have to look next at the places where others could barely stand at all. The rise of the United States cannot be understood without the wreckage around it. Europe had not merely fought a war. It had been bombed, occupied, starved, divided, and drained. Cities had become ruins. Railways had been broken. Factories had been destroyed or seized. Families had been scattered across borders, camps, roads, and graves. Britain had survived but was exhausted. France had been occupied and liberated into uncertainty. Germany was collapsing into rubble and defeat. Eastern Europe had been torn apart between Nazi occupation and Soviet advance. And against that background, the United States appeared not only powerful, but unusually whole. The United States appeared not only powerful, but unusually whole. That is the fact that has to sit at the centre of this moment. By 1945, much of Europe had not simply been defeated, liberated, occupied, or rearranged. It had been physically broken. The old continent that had once sent armies, bankers, settlers, goods, languages and empires across the world was now full of cities with their roofs gone, train stations without tracks, factories without machines, bridges lying in rivers, farms without horses, ports full of wreckage, and families trying to find one another across borders that no longer felt stable. The war had not passed over Europe like a storm that left the buildings wet and the streets muddy. It had entered the walls, the cellars, the rail yards, the churches, the schools, the apartment blocks, the villages, and the bodies of the people who survived it. To understand why America stood so tall at the end of World War II, you have to look directly at what others were standing in, not as a comparison meant to make suffering into a contest, but because power after a war is never measured only by who won. It is measured by who still has roads that work, who still has factories that can produce, who still has banks that can lend, who still has farms that can feed people, who still has ports that can receive ships, who still has a government able to collect taxes and enforce decisions, and who still has people with enough strength left to rebuild. The United States had lost more than 400,000 military personnel in the war. That loss was enormous, and every number inside it was a person, a family, a chair left empty, a photograph on a mantle, a letter kept in a drawer. But the American homeland had not been bombed into ruins. Its railroads still ran. Its factories were not piles of brick. Its electrical systems functioned. Its farmland had not been churned into battlefields. Its cities had not been occupied street by street. That difference changed everything. Picture Europe in the final months of the war. In Germany, cities such as Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, Essen, and many others had been devastated by bombing and ground fighting. Blocks of apartment buildings stood open to the air, their rooms exposed like broken dollhouses. People cooked in ruins, slept in cellars, dug through rubble for belongings, and carried water in buckets because pipes no longer worked. In some places, the dead were still under collapsed buildings. In others, refugees and soldiers moved through the same roads, everyone hungry, everyone uncertain who would control the next town by morning. Germany had begun the war with dreams of conquest and racial empire. It ended with its own cities shattered, its government collapsing, its army surrendering, and its people facing occupation, guilt, hunger, and the consequences of crimes committed across the continent in their name and with their participation. France had been liberated, but liberation did not mean instant recovery. The country had endured occupation, shortages, forced labour, collaboration, resistance, Allied bombing of transport targets, German reprisals, and the violence of fighting after D-Day. Rail lines were damaged, bridges were gone, ports had to be cleared, farms had suffered, industry had been disrupted. The French state had to rebuild authority while dealing with the legacy of Vichy, resistance groups, returning prisoners, political conflict, and the material difficulty of feeding and heating a population after years of strain. People celebrated in the streets when liberation came, and those celebrations were real. But the next morning there was still the question of bread, coal, transport, housing, and who could be trusted. Britain had survived, and that word matters. Survived. It had not been conquered. It had stood through the Blitz, fought in North Africa, held the Atlantic lifeline open, contributed to the bombing campaign, helped plan and launch the invasion of Normandy, and remained one of the great Allied powers. But survival had cost it dearly. British cities had been bombed. Families had spent nights in shelters. Children had been evacuated. Merchant ships had been sunk. The country had borrowed heavily, sold overseas assets, rationed tightly, and placed its entire economy under wartime pressure. London still had power as a capital, and Britain still had empire, navy, diplomacy, and pride. But underneath all of that was exhaustion. The war had drained the British treasury and exposed how difficult it would be to remain the kind of global power it had once been. The Soviet Union had carried a level of destruction and death that is almost impossible to hold in the mind for long. Cities such as Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, and many others had suffered siege, occupation, battle, starvation, execution, destruction, and loss on a scale that dwarfed anything experienced on American soil. Villages had been burned. Factories had been moved east or destroyed. Agricultural regions had been ravaged. Millions of soldiers and civilians were dead. The Red Army had done a huge part of the fighting that broke Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union emerged from the war as a military giant with enormous influence in Eastern Europe. But it was a giant bleeding heavily. Its victory was real, but so was its devastation. Its power after the war came with fear, occupation, sacrifice, and a memory of invasion so deep that it shaped every decision its leaders made. Poland had been crushed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in ways that left the country wounded beyond easy description. Warsaw, after years of occupation and the failed uprising of 1944, was deliberately destroyed by German forces until much of the city lay in ruins. Millions of Polish citizens were dead, including most of Poland's Jewish population, murdered in the Holocaust. Borders would shift westward. People would be expelled, resettled, uprooted, and forced to begin again in places that had belonged to someone else before the war. In Eastern Europe more broadly, the end of Nazi domination did not bring simple freedom. It often brought Soviet control, new security services, new political pressures, and a future in which liberation and domination could arrive wearing different uniforms. The Netherlands had endured occupation and hunger, including the terrible famine of the winter of 1944 to 1945. Belgium had been occupied and fought over. Italy had lived through fascism, invasion, civil conflict, bombing, and a campaign that moved slowly up the peninsula. Greece had suffered occupation, famine, resistance, reprisals, and would soon fall into civil war. Across the continent there were displaced persons everywhere. Former prisoners of war, forced labourers, concentration camp survivors, refugees, orphaned children, widows, people expelled from territories, people who had fled advancing armies, people who did not know whether home still existed, and people who could not go home because home had become dangerous or politically impossible. This is one of the most important things to understand about 1945. The war ended, but movement did not stop. Millions of people were on roads, in camps, at border crossings, in train stations, or waiting for transport that might not come. Some were trying to return home after years in forced labour in Germany. Some were Jews who had survived camps and ghettos and discovered that their families, houses, communities, and old lives had been erased. Some were Germans fleeing or expelled from Eastern Europe. Some were political refugees afraid of new regimes. Some were children too young to explain where they came from. Europe after the war was not a neat map with coloured borders. It was a human flood moving through damaged infrastructure under military occupation and emergency relief. Now set that beside the United States in 1945. American cities were crowded, busy and strained, but not ruined. Detroit had produced tanks and engines. Los Angeles had grown through aircraft and shipbuilding. New York remained a financial and communications centre. Chicago's rail yards, stockyards and factories still worked. Pittsburgh's steel mills still stood. Texas oil fields still pumped. California shipyards and aircraft plants still had equipment and skilled workers. The Great Plains still produced grain. The rail network still connected the interior to the coasts. American ports were busy with troops and cargo, not blocked by sunken wreckage in the same way many European ports had been. The United States had problems, deep ones, but it had the physical capacity to act. That capacity gave American leaders leverage. When other countries needed food, fuel, loans, machinery, ships, and reconstruction support, the United States was the country most able to provide them. When Europe needed help restarting trade and industry, American factories could supply machinery and goods. When currencies were unstable and governments short of dollars, American finance mattered. When displaced persons needed relief, American military and civilian agencies were involved. When defeated countries needed occupation administration, American troops and officials were present. A country that can feed, lend, occupy, rebuild, and organise after a war gains influence even without asking for it. Others may resent that influence, they may fear it, they may welcome it. Often they do all three, but they cannot ignore it. The old European powers understood this even if they did not always say it plainly. Britain remained important, but it depended increasingly on American support. France wanted to regain its status and rebuild its sovereignty, but it needed assistance and security. Germany was defeated and divided into occupation zones. Italy had to rebuild after fascism and war. Much of Eastern Europe was falling under Soviet domination. The map of power had shifted. Before the war, global influence had still been shared among European empires and rising non-European powers. After the war, two countries stood above the rest in military and political weight: the United States and the Soviet Union. But even between those two, the contrast was striking. The Soviet Union had armies in Eastern Europe and enormous strategic depth, but it had also suffered catastrophic destruction. The United States had global reach, atomic research nearing its terrible conclusion, a vast navy, a huge air force, immense production, financial strength, and no ruined homeland to rebuild. This did not happen, because American leaders planned every step from the beginning. History was not that tidy. But by the end of the war, they could see the position their country occupied. At conferences such as Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, American presidents and diplomats sat with British and Soviet leaders to discuss not only how to finish the war, but what would happen afterward. Borders, occupation zones, elections, reparations, Germany's future, Poland's future, The war against Japan, the United Nations, all of these questions forced the United States into decisions far beyond anything it had wanted to carry in the 1930s. A country that had once tried to avoid entanglement was now entangled in the fate of entire continents. For ordinary Americans, this new role was not always easy to understand. A family in Kansas or Ohio or Oregon might have followed the war through maps and radio bulletins, but global leadership could still feel distant. They wanted their sons home. They wanted rationing to end. They wanted factories to keep providing work without the war. They wanted prices stable. They wanted to buy cars again, build homes, have children, go to school, and return to something called normal. But normal was no longer waiting where they had left it. The country had changed too much. Millions of veterans would return with benefits through the GI Bill, entering colleges, buying homes and reshaping the middle class. Wartime industries would convert to peacetime production. Suburbs would expand. The federal government would remain larger than it had been before. American businesses would look overseas. American leaders would worry that economic collapse in Europe could lead to political extremism or Soviet influence. The domestic future and the global future were now tied together. Europe's broken condition made that connection urgent. Hunger and unemployment were not only humanitarian problems, they were political dangers. A factory that could not reopen meant workers without wages. Workers without wages could become angry. Governments that could not deliver food or stability could lose legitimacy. Communist parties, many strengthened by resistance movements and the prestige of the Soviet victory, gained influence in countries such as France and Italy. American officials worried that misery could create openings for Soviet power. This fear would grow into policies of containment and reconstruction. The Marshall Plan would come after the immediate war years, but the logic was already forming. If Europe remained broken, the peace would not hold, and American security would not be safe behind oceans anymore. This was a major change in American thinking. After World War I, the United States had retreated from many international commitments, refusing to join the League of Nations and turning inward during the 1920s and 1930s. After World War II, that kind of retreat looked much more dangerous to policymakers. They believed the failures after the First War had helped create the conditions for the Second. Economic collapse, bitterness, nationalism, isolation, and weak international structures had all played their part. This time, American leaders did not intend to leave Europe to rebuild alone. Not entirely. Not if they could help shape the recovery and the rules. The United Nations was part of this new attitude. Unlike the League of Nations, which the United States had never joined, the United Nations was built with American participation at the centre. Its headquarters would be in New York. Its Security Council reflected the power realities of the victorious Allies. It was not a world government, and it would not prevent all conflict, but it represented the idea that the United States would remain inside international institutions instead of standing outside them. That alone showed how far the country had moved from the mood of the 1930s. Military presence was another sign. American troops occupied parts of Germany and Austria, remained in Japan after its surrender, and maintained bases and responsibilities across the world. The United States had learned during the war how to build and operate a global network of bases, airfields, ports, supply depots, and command structures. Once built, that network did not simply vanish. Some of it was reduced, some troops came home, but the habit of overseas presence remained. American security had been redefined. It now included Europe's balance of power, the future of Germany and Japan, sea lanes, air routes, and the political direction of countries far from American shores. The brokenness of Europe also changed culture and psychology. For many people around the world, the United States began to represent abundance. American soldiers had brought chocolate, cigarettes, canned food, gum, coffee, and wages that seemed large in comparison with local conditions. American films, music, magazines, and goods had already travelled abroad before the war, but after 1945 they carried the shine of a country that looked modern, rich, and undamaged. This did not mean everyone loved America. Many people admired and resented it at the same time. Abundance can look generous to the hungry and arrogant to the proud. American confidence could feel hopeful or overwhelming depending on who was watching. There is a small scene worth imagining here. A European family standing in a damaged street after liberation sees American trucks passing through. The vehicles are heavy, numerous, and well supplied. The soldiers have boots, fuel, food, cigarettes, and spare equipment. The family may be grateful. They may also notice the imbalance immediately. Their own city has holes in it. Their own cupboards are thin. Their own money may be unstable. The Americans seem to arrive from a different material universe, one where things are still being made, packed, shipped, and replaced. That impression mattered. Power is not only what governments calculate, it is also what ordinary people perceive when they see who has enough. American officials sometimes underestimated how complicated this perception could be. To them, aid and reconstruction were practical and strategic. To Europeans, assistance could be life-saving, but it also raised questions about dependence, dignity, and influence. Would American money come with American expectations? Would reconstruction mean recovery, or a new kind of economic dominance? Would Europe regain its own strength, or become permanently secondary to the United States and the Soviet Union? These questions did not all have simple answers, and they would shape post-war politics for decades. Still, in 1945, the immediate reality was hard to deny. Europe needed help. The United States could provide it. Germany was defeated. Britain was exhausted. France was rebuilding. Eastern Europe was under Soviet pressure. The Soviet Union was powerful, but devastated and suspicious. The United States had emerged with unmatched industrial and financial strength. This combination made America stand taller than ever before, not because it had avoided sacrifice, but because it had avoided the kind of destruction that weakens a nation's bones. Its strength was both earned and circumstantial. It came from production, geography, resources, labour, military action, finance, and the terrible fact that other centres of power had been shattered. And yet the height America reached in 1945 was not comfortable. Standing taller meant being seen from farther away. It meant every decision cast a longer shadow. What should be done with Germany? How should Japan be occupied? How much should be shared with the Soviet Union? Could the alliance survive now that the common enemy was collapsing? What did freedom mean in countries where Soviet troops remained? What responsibility did America have toward refugees and survivors? How much money should be spent rebuilding others when Americans wanted homes, jobs, and peace? Should the United States keep a large military or return to a smaller peacetime force? These were not questions a distant republic could avoid anymore. The war had lifted America into a position where withdrawal itself would be a decision with global consequences. That may be one of the clearest signs of power. A weak country can be ignored. A strong country is judged even when it does nothing. By 1945, American inaction would be felt as action. If it refused aid, governments might fall. If it withdrew troops, power vacuums might open. If it ignored Europe's hunger, instability might spread. If it failed to shape the occupation of Germany and Japan, others would shape them instead. The country that had once hoped oceans could protect it now found that oceans connected it to responsibilities it had never fully wanted. The final months of the war made this even sharper. Germany surrendered in May 1945, but the war against Japan continued. American forces were fighting through Okinawa, preparing for the possibility of invasion, bombing Japanese cities, tightening blockade, and moving closer to decisions that would define the new age. In Europe, victory had revealed ruins. In the Pacific, victory had not yet arrived, and the cost of forcing surrender still loomed. At the same time, deep inside secret facilities in the United States, scientists, soldiers, engineers, and officials were nearing completion of a weapon unlike anything used before. The same industrial and scientific system that had built ships and bombers had also built the machinery of the atomic bomb. American power was about to step into a form that even its own leaders did not fully understand, and the world America inherited would not be shaped only by money, oil, steel, and Europe's broken cities, but by the sudden knowledge that one country had crossed a threshold no nation had crossed before. American power was about to step into a form that even its own leaders did not fully understand, and the world America inherited would not be shaped only by money, oil, steel, and Europe's broken cities, but by the sudden knowledge that one country had crossed a threshold no nation had crossed before. For years, the United States had been building ships, trucks, aircraft, tanks, rifles, engines, radios and supplies in quantities that changed the war. But hidden beneath that visible production was another kind of work, quieter, guarded, expensive, and almost completely secret. It did not happen in one factory town or one shipyard. It spread across laboratories, deserts, universities, military offices, industrial plants, and fenced-off places with names that meant very little to the public at the time. Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Hanford. The Manhattan Project became one of the clearest signs of what American power had become during the war. It joined government money, military urgency, scientific talent, industrial capacity, secrecy, and enormous engineering effort into a single project whose purpose was to build a weapon using the energy inside the atom. Think about what that required. It was not enough to have a theory. Many countries had scientists who understood the basic questions of nuclear fission. It was not enough to have fear that Germany might be working on such a weapon. Fear can begin a project, but fear alone cannot separate uranium isotopes, build reactors, produce plutonium, design explosive mechanisms, construct whole towns for workers, guard secrets across thousands of miles, and spend billions of dollars without public debate. The United States could do this because the war had already taught it how to organise on a massive scale. It had the money, it had the industrial base, it had access to refugee scientists who had fled Europe and brought knowledge with them. It had universities that could be pulled into government work. It had land where secret facilities could be built. It had a military command willing to push the work forward. The atomic bomb was not separate from the industrial war effort. It was the most extreme expression of it. For the workers at Oak Ridge in Tennessee, much of the work was hidden even from them. Thousands of people did jobs without fully knowing the final purpose. They operated machines, checked gauges, handled paperwork, maintained equipment, cleaned floors, repaired systems, and followed rules inside a city that had appeared almost out of nowhere. At Hanford in Washington state, reactors produced plutonium in a landscape transformed by federal power. At Los Alamos in New Mexico, scientists, engineers, soldiers, technicians, families, guards, and administrators lived inside a secret community on a mesa, working under pressure toward a result that many understood could change the war and perhaps the future of human life. This was not the old image of an inventor alone in a room. It was modern science as a national system. On July 16th, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the first atomic bomb was tested at Trinity. The explosion proved that the device worked. It also made the question no longer theoretical. The United States now possessed a weapon with destructive power, far beyond conventional bombs. By then, Germany had already surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Japan had not surrendered. American forces had taken Iwo Jima and Okinawa at terrible cost. Japanese cities were already being devastated by conventional bombing. A naval blockade was tightening. American planners were preparing for a possible invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation expected to bring enormous casualties. Japanese leaders were divided, fearful, stubborn, and constrained by military politics, imperial authority, and the reality of a collapsing war. Into that situation came the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, it dropped a second on Nagasaki. The destruction was immediate, overwhelming, and human in the most terrible sense. Buildings vanished, fires spread. People were burned, crushed, blinded, poisoned by radiation, separated from families, and left wandering through cities that had become impossible to recognize. Many died instantly. Many died later from injuries and radiation sickness. The official American explanation was that the bombs helped force Japan's surrender and avoided a land invasion that might have killed vast numbers of American and Japanese people. That argument became central to how many Americans understood the decision. But from the beginning, and even more as the years passed, others asked hard questions. Was Japan already close to surrender? Were there alternatives? Was a demonstration possible? How much did the Soviet entry into the war against Japan affect the surrender decision? Was the second bomb necessary? What did it mean for one nation to use such a weapon against cities filled with civilians? A history-based telling cannot pretend those questions are easy, and it should not flatten them into slogans. The atomic bombings helped end the war, but they also opened a moral wound that has never fully closed. They showed that American power had reached a level where one decision from above could destroy a city in seconds and leave survivors carrying the consequences for the rest of their lives. They ended one kind of war and began another kind of fear. Before August 1945, the United States was already the strongest industrial and financial power in the Allied world. After August 1945, it was also the first atomic power. That fact changed how every government looked at Washington. It changed how American leaders looked at themselves. It changed how ordinary people imagined the future. Victory no longer meant only parades, homecomings, and the lowering of flags. It also meant air raid drills, civil defense plans, mushroom cloud photographs, and the knowledge that science had given governments the ability to destroy on a scale that felt almost beyond politics. Japan surrendered in August 1945 and World War II ended. In American towns, people filled streets, kissed strangers, rang bells, cried, shouted, and stood stunned by relief. Families who had been waiting for sons, husbands, brothers, daughters, and friends allowed themselves to imagine homecomings again. Factories that had run day and night faced conversion back to civilian production. Soldiers began the long process of demobilization. Sailors looked toward home ports. War workers wondered whether their jobs would last. Children who had grown up with rationing and maps and scrap drives heard adults speak of peace, as if it were a place everyone could finally enter. But peace in 1945 was not a return to 1941. The country coming out of the war was not the same country that had gone in. The United States now had forces stationed around the world. It had occupied territory to administer. Germany and Japan had to be rebuilt and politically transformed under Allied control. Europe needed food, coal, machinery, loans, and stability. Asia was full of collapsing empires, civil wars, revolutions, hunger, and questions about who would rule after Japan's defeat. Britain and France still had empires, but the war had weakened their ability to hold them as before. India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Korea, China, the Philippines, and many other places were moving into new struggles, shaped by nationalism, communism, anti-colonial resistance, occupation, and the power vacuum left by defeated Japan and exhausted Europe. The United States had helped win a global war. Now it had to face a global aftermath. This is where the United Nations comes in. The idea behind it was not simply idealism, though idealism was part of it. It was also the result of hard memory. After World War I, the League of Nations had been created with hopes of preventing another catastrophe, but the United States never joined, and the League failed to stop aggression in the 1930s. American leaders did not want to repeat that pattern. In 1945, representatives from nations gathered in San Francisco to create the United Nations. The organization was meant to provide a forum where countries could address disputes, coordinate relief, support development, and, at least in theory, prevent future wars through collective security. Its structure reflected the realities of power. The Security Council gave permanent seats and veto power to the major Allied victors, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. This was not a purely equal gathering of nations. It was an institution built around the hope of cooperation and the recognition that great powers had to be kept inside the system if the system was to matter. For the United States, joining the United Nations marked a major break from the old reluctance to participate in international institutions. The headquarters would eventually be placed in New York, which itself said something about the new centre of gravity. Diplomats from around the world would come to American soil to argue, negotiate, accuse, plead, and vote. The United States was no longer a distant republic occasionally drawn into world affairs. It had become one of the main rooms where world affairs would be discussed. That did not mean the United Nations would solve every problem. It did not prevent the Cold War. It did not stop all wars, genocides, occupations, or injustices. But it gave the post-war world a structure, and America stood inside that structure from the beginning. At the same time, another structure had already been prepared at Bretton Woods, where the dollar became central to the international financial order. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were designed to help stabilize currencies, support reconstruction, and avoid some of the economic chaos that had followed the First World War and the Great Depression. Again, these institutions were not charity in a simple sense. They reflected American interests as well as global needs. A stable world economy would help prevent political collapse, expand trade, and create markets for American goods. A rebuilt Europe could buy, produce, and resist Soviet pressure. A functioning international financial system would make American leadership practical rather than merely rhetorical. Money, like military power, became part of the peace. The occupation of Germany showed how complicated victory could be. Germany was divided into zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, was also divided. At first, the Allies agreed that Germany had to be demilitarized, denazified, and prevented from starting another war. But the question of how to do that became more difficult as relations between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies worsened. Germany was not simply a defeated enemy. It became the central problem of Europe's future. Should it be punished, rebuilt, divided, neutralized, integrated, supervised, or transformed? The answer changed over time, especially as American officials came to see West Germany's recovery as essential to European stability. The ruins of Germany became one of the first major stages of the Cold War. Japan's occupation was different, but just as important. Under American leadership, especially through General Douglas MacArthur's authority, Japan was demilitarized, politically restructured, and given a new constitution. The emperor remained, but his status changed. The military was dismantled. Democratic reforms were introduced. Land reform, labour rights, women's suffrage, education changes, and constitutional limits on war became part of the occupation programme. This was an extraordinary reversal. The country that had attacked Pearl Harbor was now being rebuilt under American supervision into a key post-war ally. The same American power that had destroyed Japanese cities also helped shape Japan's post-war political and economic direction. That contradiction is hard, but it is central to the story. The Soviet Union stood on the other side of the New World. During the war, it had been an ally, and without the Soviet fight against Nazi Germany, the war in Europe could not have been won in the same way. But alliance did not mean trust. The United States and the Soviet Union had different political systems, different security fears, different plans for Eastern Europe, and different ideas about the future. The Soviet Union wanted friendly or controlled governments along its western border after being invaded twice by Germany in the first half of the century. The United States wanted open markets, political self-determination in principle, and a Europe not dominated by Moscow. These goals collided almost immediately. Eastern Europe became the first great area of tension. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary and other countries fell under Soviet influence or control. Elections were manipulated. Opposition parties were pressured or eliminated. Security services grew powerful. To Soviet leaders, this was a defensive buffer and the reward of victory. To American leaders, it looked like expansion and betrayal of wartime promises. In 1946, Winston Churchill spoke in Missouri of an iron curtain descending across Europe. The phrase captured something many already sensed. The wartime alliance was giving way to a divided world. America's inheritance was not a peaceful globe ready to be led. It was a damaged world entering a new rivalry. The United States responded with policies that would define decades. The Truman Doctrine promised support for countries resisting communist pressure, beginning with aid to Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan offered massive economic assistance to rebuild Western Europe. NATO would follow as a military alliance tying the United States permanently to the defence of Western Europe. These steps came after the war, but their roots were in the position created by World War II. America had the money to aid. It had the military reach to guarantee. It had the fear of another collapse. It had the belief that security could no longer be separated from conditions overseas. The war had taught American leaders that weakness in Europe could become danger for America. The Cold War turned that lesson into policy. At home, the meaning of victory changed daily life. Millions of veterans returned and used the GI Bill to attend college, buy homes, and start businesses. This helped expand the American middle class, though benefits were often distributed unequally, especially because black veterans faced discrimination in housing, lending, education, and local administration. Factories converted back to consumer goods. Families bought cars, refrigerators, washing machines, radios, and eventually televisions. Suburbs grew. Babies were born in large numbers. Highways, mortgages, universities, and defense spending became parts of a new American landscape. The power America gained abroad fed back into life at home. The country's global role supported industries, jobs, research, and a sense of national mission. But it also carried costs, military budgets, foreign commitments, nuclear fear, anti-communist politics, and the burden of being involved almost everywhere. This is one of the most important things to understand about the phrase most powerful country on earth. It does not mean the happiest country, the fairest country, or the country free from fear. Power brought comfort to many Americans, but it also brought anxiety. Children practiced duck and cover drills because adults feared atomic war. Scientists who had helped build the bomb sometimes warned against the arms race that followed. Veterans carried trauma that families did not always know how to name. Women who had worked in wartime industries were pushed back toward domestic roles, even after proving their abilities. Black Americans who had fought fascism returned to segregation and began pushing harder for civil rights. Japanese American families came home from incarceration to lost property and broken trust. The new America was rich and strong, but not settled. The atomic monopoly did not last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb. The United States no longer stood alone in the atomic age. The arms race accelerated. Hydrogen bombs followed. Military planning entered a level of destruction that made earlier wars seem almost limited by comparison. World War II had made America the most powerful country on earth, but the new measure of power included the ability to end civilization. That is a strange and heavy inheritance. A nation could be strong enough to frighten itself. Yet American power after the war was not only military or nuclear, it was also cultural. American films, music, brands, clothing, magazines, and consumer goods spread widely. Jazz, swing, Hollywood, Coca-Cola, blue jeans, and later rock and roll became part of the global image of America. In countries recovering from war, American abundance could seem almost unreal. Supermarkets, cars, suburbs, and household appliances became symbols of a life many people wanted, or at least noticed. This cultural reach mattered because power is not only what armies can do, it's also what people imagine when they think of a country's future. The United States sold not only goods, but an image of modern life. Of course, that image was incomplete. It often left out poverty, racism, labour conflict, gender limits, political fear, and the people who did not fit the bright advertisement version of post-war America. But images do not need to be complete to be influential. Around the world, America became associated with plenty, speed, youth, technology, movies, music, and the promise that ordinary life could be made easier through consumption. The factories that had built bombers now helped build the consumer age. The war economy did not simply stop. Many of its tools, skills, and expectations were redirected. So how did World War II make America the most powerful country on Earth? Not through one cause, not through a single battle, law, leader, bomb, factory, or speech. It happened because many forces converged at once. The United States entered the war with enormous resources and industrial potential. The war forced it to mobilize that potential at full scale. Its factories produced the weapons and supplies that armed itself and its allies. Its shipyards gave it global reach. Its soldiers, sailors, pilots, nurses, engineers and workers carried that power overseas. Its oil, steel, food and finance gave it endurance. Its homeland remained physically intact while much of Europe and Asia was damaged or exhausted. Its scientists and military built the atomic bomb. Its leaders helped design new international institutions. Its economy emerged stronger while other economies struggled to stand. By 1945, the United States had not only won a war, it had become the country around which much of the post-war world would be organised. But the most honest way to end this story is not with a flag waving over a perfect victory. It is with a quieter picture. Imagine a troop ship coming home in late 1945 or 1946. Men crowd the railings as the American coastline appears. Some are laughing, some are silent, some are thinking about the people they lost. Some are planning to marry, work, study, buy a house, or sleep for a week. They are returning to a country richer and stronger than the one they left, but also different in ways they cannot fully see yet. Behind them are battlefields, ruined cities, occupied countries, camps, graves, oceans crossed and recrossed. Ahead of them are suburbs, college classrooms, factories, the Cold War, atomic fear, civil rights struggles, consumer abundance, and a government that will never again be as small or as distant from the world as it once seemed. One of those men steps off the ship carrying a duffel bag. Maybe he has a few souvenirs. Maybe he has letters tied together with string. Maybe he has a photograph folded in his wallet. He's not thinking about Bretton Woods or the United Nations or containment policy, or the dollar's new role in global finance. He's thinking about the person waiting for him, the train home, the food he wants to eat, the bed he wants to sleep in, the quiet he hopes will return. And yet he is walking into the new American century. The war has made his country powerful enough to shape peace, powerful enough to rebuild enemies, powerful enough to frighten rivals, powerful enough to promise protection, powerful enough to make mistakes on a global scale. That is the burden hidden inside the victory. Before the war, America could imagine itself as protected by distance. After the war, distance had lost much of its meaning. Before the war, it could argue about whether Europe or Asia mattered to its own future. After the war, those arguments sounded different because American troops, money, bases and promises were already there. Before the war, it had enormous potential. After the war, the world had seen what that potential could do when fully awakened. The giant was no longer half asleep. It was standing in the open, with the ruins of the old world around it, the atomic age above it, and a future approaching that would ask again and again what all that power was for.